In this episode, we journey deep into the chaotic yet heartfelt story of Peter and Lois Griffin. Through laughter, heartbreak, and resilience, we explore their messy love, the bonds with their children, and the legacy of persistence that defines the Griffin family in all its dysfunctional beauty. The Griffin household has always been the quiet center of chaos. A suburban home that looks ordinary on the outside, yet hides within it the echoes of 1,000 peculiar moments. When we step into that living room in Quahog, we're not just looking at a couch, a TV, or staircase. We're stepping into the heart of Peter and Lois, two people whose lives collided in strange, passionate, messy, and often absurd ways. Their marriage, for better or worse, has become the gravitational pull around which everything else in the Griffin universe orbits. And it's here in their story that we begin this chapter. Peter Griffin was never the man of ambition or polish. He wasn't destined to be a towering figure of wealth or sophistication. He was and always will be Peter, bumbling, unpredictable, reckless in thought and action, and yet somehow endearing in his stubbornness. Lois, on the other hand, came from refinement, from a background of wealth and cultured expectation. Their lives were not supposed to intersect, yet when they did, it created a spark, not the kind of spark that slowly fades, but one that has kept burning, sometimes wildly, sometimes dimly, throughout the entirety of their shared life. Think back to the earliest days of their union. Lois, elegant, sharp, and poised, seemed almost sculpted for a different man, a man who could match her world of class and status. Yet she found herself drawn to Peter, a man who was, in many ways, the antithesis of her upbringing. Was it rebellion? Perhaps. Was it love? Without doubt. It was both, tangled together in the kind of way that defied reason and demanded to be felt. Their relationship blossomed, not through careful planning or strategy, but through the chaotic rush of being swept up in each other. Lois saw in Peter a kind of freedom, a lack of pretension, that stood against the rigid expectations her family had always tried to enforce. For Peter, Lois was more than just a partner. She was an anchor, a voice that grounded him even as his wild impulses tried to carry him away. In the meeting of those two extremes, a balance was struck, albeit a balance that often teetered dangerously. As years passed, their bond deepened in ways that only shared laughter, arguments, disappointments, and reconciliations can create. They became, without realizing it, two halves of a single rhythm, with Lois guiding Peter through life's responsibilities and Peter dragging Lois into the unpredictable whirlwind of his misadventures. Theirs was not a love story crafted in the image of perfection, but one rooted in the raw, unpolished reality of two people who somehow chose each other again and again, no matter the chaos around them. It's worth remembering that Peter and Lois were never meant to be symbols of flawless romance. They are, instead, symbols of resilience, the resilience of a couple who, despite the countless absurdities life throws at them, somehow find their way back into each other's arms. Their home may not be perfect. Their arguments may be loud. Their missteps may be many. But their bond has a way of surviving. And survival, in a world as bizarre as Quahog, is its own kind of love. When we think of the Griffin family, it is tempting to imagine that Peter is the chaotic energy, while Lois is the grounding force, the calm in the storm. But the truth is more layered than that. Lois has her own hidden wildness, her own streaks of passion and rebellion that flare up when she least expects them. And Peter, in all his childishness, has moments, rare though they may be, where he reveals a tenderness, a devotion to Lois that surprises even himself. Together, they create a love that is flawed but enduring, chaotic but real. The early years of their marriage were filled with contradictions. On one hand, there was romance, the kind that comes from stolen moments and late-night conversations where the world fades and only two people remain. On the other hand, there were the cracks that showed themselves early on. Peter's lack of ambition, his irresponsibility, and Lois's awareness that her life could have been something very different had she chosen another path. And yet, even when the cracks grew wide, she stayed. Perhaps because deep down, she knew that love is not about the flawless picture, but about the choice to see beauty even when the picture is smudged. Peter and Lois's marriage is a dance, a clumsy one, yes, but a dance nonetheless. Sometimes Peter leads, stumbling, tripping, pulling Lois into absurdity. Sometimes Lois leads, graceful yet stern, guiding Peter back towards something resembling order. But always, always, they find themselves moving together, no matter how offbeat the rhythm may be. And that is what makes their relationship so strangely captivating. It's easy to laugh at Peter's antics, to roll eyes at his impulsiveness, to shake one's head at the disasters that follow him wherever he goes. But look closer, and you'll see Lois watching him, exasperated yet affectionate, knowing that in some strange way, this is the man she chose. And look closer still, and you'll see Peter watching Lois, realizing that beneath all the frustrations and arguments, she is the reason his world has meaning. Their love is not the shining, polished kind you find in fairy tales. It's not the kind that comes wrapped in ribbons and bow-tied promises. Instead, it's messy, imperfect, and sometimes infuriating. But it is precisely that imperfection that makes it enduring. In Peter and Lois, we see a reflection of something deeply human. The ability to love someone not because they are perfect, but because they are not, and because, despite all odds, they remain ours. And so as we begin this chapter, we linger on that living room couch, on the home where their lives intersect and unfold. The TV flickers. Peter laughs too loudly. Lois sighs but stays beside him. And the world of Quahog hums around them. It's the simple act of being together through thick and thin, through absurdity and intimacy, that keeps their story alive. Because Peter and Lois Griffin are not just characters in a cartoon. They are symbols of how love, in all its flawed glory, survives in the unlikeliest of places. And in that survival, we find not only humor, but a strange, soothing comfort. Peter's identity as a husband is often portrayed as comical, careless, and frustrating. Yet within the folds of this dynamic, there are glimpses of tenderness that reveal how deeply he cares for Lois, even if he rarely expresses it in the conventional eyes. To her, Peter represents chaos and unpredictability, but also the force that keeps her life from ever falling into monotony. She could have married someone like Quagmire, who would have smothered her with affection and flattery, or someone more stable like Cleveland, who might have provided steadiness but little adventure. Yet Lois chose Peter because beneath the childishness and impulsivity was a man who could make her laugh through any storm. And for Lois, laughter was the most intoxicating kind of love. It's important to understand that Peter's love for Lois often hides behind absurdity. He might ruin dinner by accidentally setting the grill on fire, or forget an anniversary because he was too invested in a ridiculous scheme. Yet the show constantly reminds us that Peter's world collapses without Lois. Time and time again, when he is faced with the possibility of losing her, whether to jealousy, separation, or even to death, his true feelings break through. In those rare moments, he shows sincerity, a kind of boyish desperation to keep her by his side, almost like He never stopped being the awkward guy who was stunned that Lois actually chose him all those years ago. Lois, on the other hand, provides the grounding force in their relationship. Without her, Peter would completely drift into chaos, lost in fantasies of beer, television, and pointless antics. But Lois never allows that to fully consume their household. She tolerates, she scolds, she guides, and sometimes she even surrenders to his nonsense, showing that her love for Peter is far from blind. It's resilient, adaptive, and strangely forgiving. Theirs is not a marriage of perfection, but rather one that thrives on imperfections, where conflict is constant, but so is loyalty. The early years of their marriage, before the children came, are a part of Family Guy lore that's rarely explored, but they hold the key to understanding why their relationship endures. In those days, Lois was still full of youthful energy, Peter was slightly more ambitious, and their connection was passionate, in ways that the series only hints at. Imagine a time when their nights weren't dominated by family responsibilities, when the idea of building a life together seemed more exciting than burdensome. Those years must have been filled with both heated arguments and equally heated reconciliations, their passion always bouncing between love and frustration. We also get subtle glimpses that Lois, despite her refined upbringing, enjoys the rebellion that comes with being Peter's partner. To her family, Peter was an embarrassing choice, a step down from the high-class men she could have married. Yet every time she defends Peter against her parents' criticism, she reaffirms her choice, not just of love, but of identity. She wasn't going to be the perfect, polished daughter of wealth. She was going to be Lois Griffin, wife of a loud, silly man, mother of a chaotic brood, and someone who refused to let tradition dictate her life. Their relationship also serves as a mirror to the audience. Many viewers see in Peter and Lois a parody of real marriages. The bickering, the tolerance of flaws, the persistence of love despite constant irritation. It all resonates with an exaggerated familiarity, but at its core, what keeps them together is not just habit or circumstance. It's that Lois needs Peter's humor as much as Peter needs Lois's grounding. Without him, she risks being consumed by the rigidity of her upbringing. Without her, he risks collapsing into total absurdity. And then there's the strange but undeniable reality that their love often shines brightest during moments of absurdity. Lois might roll her eyes when Peter comes home with a ridiculous purchase or drags the family into a pointless adventure. But she's also the first to stand by his side when the consequences spiral out of control. That balance, the ability to be both exasperated and supportive, defines the resilience of their marriage. Of course, passion plays its role too. While Family Guy often frames their intimacy for laughs, underneath the jokes, there's a layer of truth. Peter and Lois's physical chemistry is both comedic and genuine, often hinting that their attraction hasn't faded, despite the chaos of raising children and living through Peter's endless antics. If anything, the humor only underscores how unusual and enduring their connection is. Lois still wants him, even when he's at his most ridiculous. This paradox of love persisting through nonsense becomes one of the most compelling threads in their shared lore. Looking back, their origin as a couple feels almost fated. Lois's rebellion against her family's expectations, combined with Peter's desperate desire to hold on to someone far above his league, created a union that shouldn't have lasted by normal standards. And yet, here they are, bound not by perfection, but by an enduring, messy love that feels strangely real. As we peel back the layers of their relationship, one can't help but wonder, what was the real glue that held Peter and Lois together through all the storms? Was it passion? Was it loyalty? Or was it simply the fact that they were both too stubborn to give up on each other? Perhaps it was all three interwoven into a story that defies both logic and expectation. What becomes fascinating is how this dynamic translated into their family life. The same qualities that made their relationship chaotic and enduring also shaped the way they became parents. From the moment Chris was born to the arrival of Meg, and eventually the unexpected presence of Stewie, their parenting style mirrored their marriage. Imperfect, exasperating, yet deeply bonded. Each child brought its own challenges and its own mark on Peter and Lois's lives, but before we can fully dive into their family-building years, there's one particular part of their story that deserves deeper exploration. Something that often lingers in the shadows of jokes and punchlines. And that is the unspoken but ever-present part of their lives, their intimacy, their private bond, the undercurrent of passion that kept their marriage alive. While Family Guy often treats their sex life as comedic material, there's something more profound hidden beneath the laughs, something that reveals as much about their relationship as their fights and reconciliations do. It is there, in those quiet moments away from the chaos of the household, that Peter and Lois truly connect, reminding themselves why they chose each other in the first place. Their physical bond becomes a way to reset, to ground themselves, and to rediscover the spark that, against all odds, still burns between them. And in that intimacy lies the answer to why, despite everything, they continue to endure together. It was always clear that Peter and Lois's marriage had layers beyond the daily chaos, but just beneath that laughter-filled surface lay a truth the show often winked at but rarely lingered on for long. Their sex life was as wild, strange, and unconventional as the rest of their lives. What we see in the gags, the sly comments, the jokes about late-night escapades, and the exaggerated flashbacks are only fragments of a deeper reality. For Peter and Lois, intimacy wasn't just about routine or necessity. It was a theater of affection, humor, experimentation, and sometimes complete absurdity. And in many ways, it reflected why they stayed so tightly bound together through decades of marriage and all the dysfunction that came with it. In their early days, the spark was almost uncontainable. Lois, coming from a wealthy, disciplined family, found in Peter the kind of reckless abandon she had been taught to avoid but secretly craved. Their first encounters were full of laughter as much as desire because Peter never separated intimacy from humor. He'd crack a joke at the wrong moment or stumble into an awkward position, but instead of breaking the mood, it somehow amplified it. Lois discovered that what made Peter different from her past suitors was that he wasn't afraid to be clumsy, to be ridiculous, or to make her laugh even in their most private moments. For her, that looseness made everything more electric, because passion mixed with laughter has a strange way of deepening bonds. As time passed, their bedroom life became a running story of experiments that sometimes succeeded and sometimes spiraled into complete nonsense. The show itself has dropped hints, Lois casually mentioning that Peter's stamina surprised her, or Peter proudly blurting out strange preferences without shame. These comedic flashes are exaggerations, yes, but they are rooted in a truth. Peter and Lois cultivated a sex life that never really dulled. Even after children, even after bills and responsibilities, they returned to each other with a spark that carried both tenderness and lunacy. Lois, fiery and confident, often took the lead. There were times when Peter, despite his childishness, was almost overwhelmed by her energy. She wasn't just a participant. She was an instigator. And in that sense, their chemistry worked because she matched his unpredictability with her own kind of daring. One can imagine that their encounters were often role-played adventures, half fantasy, half comedy routine, where Lois's boldness collided with Peter's bumbling imagination. This mixture was the secret recipe. Passion fueled by comedy, intensity balanced by silliness, an intimacy that could make them collapse in laughter one moment and fall into genuine closeness the next. The show occasionally shows Peter and Lois in moments that border on scandalous, suggesting their adventures weren't limited to quiet nights. Sometimes, their desire for one another bubbled over into public or unexpected places. Those gags, when stripped of their cartoon exaggeration, suggest a couple who simply couldn't keep their hands off one another, even after years of marriage. It paints the picture of two people who never allowed routine to extinguish the heat that sparked their union in the first place. For Peter, Lois was not just a wife, but a symbol of everything unattainable that he somehow won. And perhaps because he felt he had reached beyond his league, he cherished her in ways that always circled back to intimacy. He often acted like a teenager smitten with his crush, unable to believe she chose him. Lois, in return, seemed to thrive on being desired with such raw enthusiasm. She may have rolled her eyes at Peter's antics, but beneath that exasperation was a woman who loved being the center of his chaotic universe. That dynamic created a sexual rhythm between them that never faded. It was always new, always chaotic, always charged. And then there were the stranger moments, the ones where Peter's wild imagination found its way into their relationship. The kind of surreal gags we see on screen, Peter bringing costumes, odd scenarios, or even ridiculous props, reflect a man who never separated fantasy from reality. Lois, being the fiery counterbalance, sometimes indulged these scenarios, not because she shared the exact fantasy, but because she enjoyed seeing Peter's unfiltered excitement. This created a cycle. Peter dreaming up outlandish ideas, Lois humoring him just enough, and both of them ending up laughing their way into genuine intimacy. The passion between them wasn't just physical. It became an anchor through life's turbulence. In those moments of connection, when the kids were asleep, or when the world outside was filled with chaos, Peter and Lois rediscovered each other. Their sex life was less about perfection and more about presence. And presence is what made it powerful. It wasn't about flawless romance. It was about two people, deeply mismatched on the surface, finding a rhythm that only they understood. That rhythm also shaped how they saw one another. For Lois, Peter's fumbling honesty, his inability to hide his desire, and his constant need for her became a reminder that she was wanted, even as the years passed. For Peter, Lois's willingness to match his fire, her energy, and even her occasional dominance made her not just a wife, but a partner who kept him alive in ways beyond the day-to-day. Their intimacy, then, was not merely physical. It was a metaphor for the way they approached life together. Messy, unpredictable, and full of laughter, yet always anchored in a strange but undeniable love. The children in their household might have defined the outward structure of their marriage, but the inward glue was this ongoing passion. It explains why, despite Peter's childishness and Lois's frustrations, they stayed together. Because every night, behind closed doors, they returned to that original spark, reliving and reinventing it with the same fiery absurdity that defined their public lives. And perhaps that's why the humor in the show never quite erases the depth between them. Each gag, each over-the-top flashback about their private moments is actually a small window into a truth. Peter and Lois never really stopped desiring each other. Their sex life was a continuation of their love story, one that might make us laugh on screen, but beneath the comedy reveals a couple who found strength, renewal, and intimacy in ways that were as strange and unique as the rest of their lives. So when we think about Peter and Lois, we can't simply see the arguments, the mismatched personalities, or the endless absurdities of their family drama. To really understand them, we have to peer into this hidden side, a space where they laughed, loved, and sometimes completely confused one another, but always reconnected. Because in that strange blend of passion and comedy, they built something that endured, even when everything else seemed ready to crumble. It's tempting to think that their sex life was simply the sort of bedroom comedy that the show loves to poke fun at. Awkward interruptions, Stewie wandering in at the worst times, or Peter misinterpreting what intimacy even is. But beneath the surface, there is a long, winding history of a relationship that constantly wrestled with passion and exhaustion, desire and duty, lust and loyalty. Lois wasn't just Peter's wife in the eyes of the law or the church. She was, for years, the only anchor that could even vaguely keep Peter's chaotic impulses tethered to the ground. And in that role, sex became less of a side note and more of a central, invisible thread in their marriage. From Lois's perspective, intimacy with Peter was never boring. If anything, it was unpredictable to the point of comedy. He might on one night be uncharacteristically tender, creating moments where she remembered why she fell in love with him in the first place. Then, just as easily, he might destroy that same tenderness the next night by bringing an ill-timed joke, a strange prop, or a distraction that broke the rhythm entirely. Yet in that instability, Lois found something oddly intoxicating, because it was never routine, and routine to Lois had always been her greatest fear. Now, there were times, more than she would ever admit, when she wondered if Peter even fully understood what intimacy meant to her. To Peter, sex was sometimes like a sport, other times like a punchline, but rarely did he attach to it the emotional depth Lois wanted. Still, there were glimpses, subtle, rare, when Peter's affection broke through the bumbling exterior. For example, after some of his biggest failures, when he lost his job or when he made a fool of himself in front of Quahog, he would retreat to her. In those moments, his affection wasn't lustful, but needy, a reaching out for comfort and validation, and Lois, in spite of herself, gave it. But perhaps the most fascinating part of their sex life isn't in how they acted as a married couple. It's how much of it blurred into the mythology of their family itself. Because unlike so many sitcom couples, Peter and Lois didn't simply fade into background figures once the kids arrived. Instead, their intimacy, messy, comedic, dysfunctional, still bled into the larger story of how the Griffin children came to be. And here's where the lore takes a deeper, stranger turn. Family Guy, with its tongue-in-cheek flashbacks, often suggests that the Griffin children were the products of accidents, bizarre circumstances, or simple negligence. Yet if one looks closely, there are breadcrumbs, hints that their origins are far more tangled than they first appear. Meg, for instance, has long been treated as the unwanted, unloved child, but Lois's memories paint a far more complicated picture. Was Meg an accident? Yes, but not in the traditional sense. Meg was born out of a night where Lois desperately sought escape, not romance. Peter, in one of his manic phases, had pulled her into a half-joking, half-serious tryst, and Lois, overwhelmed by her own stress, gave in. And from that one night of carelessness, Meg was conceived. Chris, on the other hand, carries an entirely different story. By the time he came into being, Peter and Lois's sex life had shifted. Passion was still there, but there was something else too, resentment. Peter, frustrated by his failures, used intimacy as a way to reclaim confidence, while Lois, more often than not, felt trapped by obligation. Chris's conception wasn't an accident in the same way Meg's was, but it also wasn't a planned act of love. It was somewhere in the middle, a strange blend of lust, fatigue, and resignation. And in that mixture, Chris inherited the heavy, confused energy of his parents, a child who was neither wholly wanted nor wholly rejected. Then there was Stewie. The mythology around Stewie's conception is perhaps the strangest of them all. Canon often pokes fun at the idea that Stewie was an accident. In the truest sense, a child never meant to exist. Yet deeper lore hints at something far more twisted. Stewie wasn't born out of romance or even obligation. He was born out of recklessness. A late-night moment where Peter, trying to prove his virility, pushed for something Lois knew was foolish. Lois, exhausted and emotionally distant, let it happen, not realizing it would result in the most unusual child of all, the baby, who would grow into a genius, a villain, and perhaps even a timeline-bending force of nature. But before we drift too far into the children, it's important to understand what underpinned all of this. Peter and Lois's sex life wasn't just about the act itself. It was about power, about distraction, about desperation. For Lois, it was sometimes an escape from the monotony of motherhood. For Peter, it was often proof that despite his failures, he still had Lois. Their intimacy, strange as it often was, formed the very fault lines from which the Griffin family emerged. And yet, if one listens closely to Lois in certain episodes, one hears the echoes of a woman who still longed for something deeper. She sometimes hinted at fantasies of other men, of alternate lives, of romances where she wasn't perpetually the caretaker of an overgrown child. In those moments, her voice softened, and you could almost feel the ache in her words. She loved Peter, yes, but she also craved the version of him he rarely showed her. The man who could be present, attentive, passionate, in a way that wasn't buried under a layer of jokes. And this duality, this push and pull, is what makes their sex life such fertile ground for lore. Because it wasn't simple. It wasn't straightforward. It was messy, layered, and human. It was the bedrock of a marriage that both thrived and collapsed, often in the same breath. It's where the children found their beginnings, where the family's dysfunction was seated, and where Lois's unspoken desires clashed with Peter's unyielding immaturity. So when we ask, was their sex life healthy? The answer is complicated. It was enough to keep them together, but not enough to keep Lois satisfied. It was enough to produce a family, but not enough to prevent resentment. And it was enough to create some of the most bizarre, twisted storylines in Family Guy lore. Stories that continue to ripple through Quahog even today. And with that, we reach the threshold of the most personal question of all. Were their children, Meg, Chris, Stewie, the results of accidents, obligations, or genuine desire? That is where the true heart of the Griffin story lies. For behind every joke, every gag, every cutaway, there is a family built on the contradictions of passion and neglect, intimacy and absence. It's funny how the simplest questions can spark the most complex reflections. And in the case of Peter and Lois, the question that often lingers in the air is one that blends humor, intimacy, and a touch of existential curiosity. Were their children accidents, or were they actually planned? It's easy to look at the Griffin household, the chaos, the mismatched personalities, the way each child seems to represent a different aspect of Peter and Lois's clashing souls, and assume that they were all just products of spontaneity, little surprises born from passion and recklessness. But the truth, much like everything in the Griffin lore, is far more layered and perhaps darker than it seems. To understand how Meg, Chris, and Stewie came into being, one must look not only at the circumstances of their conception, but also at the emotional landscape of their parents at the time. The Griffin children are not merely random additions to the family tree. Each one reflects a particular chapter of Peter and Lois's relationship, almost like a living timestamp of where their marriage stood in that moment. Meg, the eldest, came into the world during what could be called Peter and Lois's naive optimism era. They were still young, still flushed with the excitement of being newly married, still under the impression that their love could conquer all obstacles. It was during this time that Lois, who had grown up in wealth and comfort, was starting to embrace Peter's more carefree and reckless lifestyle. To Lois, starting a family felt like the natural extension of her rebellion against her father's rigid expectations. She wanted a baby not just out of maternal instinct, but out of a desire to prove to Carter Pewterschmidt that she could build her own version of happiness, one that didn't rely on his money or approval. Peter, on the other hand, wasn't exactly thinking in terms of legacy or rebellion. For him, the idea of having a child felt like the ultimate proof that he and Lois were building something real, something permanent. He wasn't calculating or deeply reflective, Peter rarely is, but in his own bumbling way, he saw fatherhood as a kind of adventure, a new level in the unpredictable game of life. That's not to say Meg was planned in the traditional sense. If anything, she was the result of Lois's desire to assert her independence and Peter's willingness to dive headfirst into anything that felt exciting in the moment. The result was Meg, a child born into a family that loved her in theory, but perhaps wasn't entirely ready to handle what parenthood demanded in practice. Chris, the middle child, emerged from a different season of their marriage, one that was less about optimism and more about maintenance. By the time Chris came along, Peter and Lois had already begun to feel the weight of daily life pressing in. The novelty of marriage had faded, replaced by bills, responsibilities, and the quiet realization that love, while powerful, doesn't automatically solve the struggles of adulthood. Yet, in that midst, there was still intimacy between them, a sort of comfort, a rhythm of physical closeness that was less about passion and more about reaffirmation. Lois, having already given birth once, approached the idea of a second child with a mix of practicality and longing. She wanted Meg to have a sibling, someone who could share in the strange, chaotic life of being a Griffin. Peter, in his own way, was swept along by the tide of Lois's conviction. It wasn't so much that Chris was meticulously planned. It was more that he became the unspoken agreement between them, the quiet reassurance that their marriage was still moving forward, still alive. But Chris's very existence carries with it the undertones of that struggle. He is the child of routine, of stability, seeking to assert itself amidst the chaos of their personalities. And then, of course, there's Stewie, the youngest, the most peculiar, and certainly the most enigmatic of the Griffin children. To call Stewie an accident almost feels insulting to the strange cosmic alignment that must have occurred to bring him into being. If Meg represented youthful rebellion and Chris represented comfort and continuity, Stewie represents something altogether different. The culmination of years of suppressed tension, unresolved desires, and the paradoxical blend of love and resentment that defined Peter and Lois's later years together. By the time Stewie was conceived, Lois and Peter's marriage had weathered countless storms: infidelity, lies, near divorces, reconciliations. It was all part of their tapestry by then. Their intimacy had become erratic, a cocktail of raw passion one moment and quiet estrangement the next. Stewie was born not from a carefully planned decision, or even from the quiet rhythm of a long-term relationship, but from one of those explosive moments where emotions ran too high to be contained. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of everything unspoken between them. Lois's buried frustrations, Peter's wild impulses, their love, their anger, their exhaustion, their persistence. This is why Stewie feels so different from his siblings, why his very character exudes a kind of intelligence and darkness that seems disproportionate to his age. He was not just a child. He was the manifestation of years of pent-up energy, the byproduct of a marriage that had long since ceased to operate on simple terms. To call him unplanned would be accurate, but to call him an accident would be missing the deeper truths. Stewie was inevitable, the almost supernatural result of Lois and Peter colliding in a moment where love and conflict blurred into something indistinguishable. And when you lay out the Griffin children this way, you begin to see them not as individuals merely shaped by their environment, but as living reflections of their parents' emotional journey. Each one marks a stage of the Peter and Lois saga. Meg, the symbol of youthful defiance, Chris, the anchor of routine and continuity, and Stewie, the volatile manifestation of chaos and suppressed intensity. But of course, like all great family stories, there are whispers beneath the surface, rumors, half-jokes, and darkly comedic hints scattered throughout the show that suggest perhaps the Griffin children aren't simply the result of passion and timing, but of more twisted undertones. Could it be that some of their births weren't entirely about love, but about manipulation, control, or even accidents gone too far? Did Lois always want 3 children, or did Peter's recklessness push her into circumstances she hadn't truly considered? These questions linger, haunting the edges of the Griffin family lore, and they invite us to look at each character not just as comedic figures, but as products of deeply human and sometimes flawed choices. And so, as the Griffin children grow, stumble, and clash with the world around them, they carry with them the weight of their origins, the subtle truth that none of them were simply meant to be, but instead were the unpredictable, chaotic results of Peter and Lois's turbulent love. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes them so fascinating to watch. Because in the end, the Griffin children are not just cartoon characters. They're living metaphors for what it means to love, to fight, to fail, and to keep trying anyway. It was in these moments of domestic chaos and seemingly unremarkable daily life that the seeds of the Griffin children's existence were sown. Each of them, whether they came to be through an impulsive choice, a night of misguided passion, or a half-hearted attempt at planned family growth, carried within their very existence the unfiltered essence of Peter and Lois themselves. For behind the jokes and the gags, behind the cutaway humor and exaggerated antics, was a marriage that oscillated between profound intimacy and sheer accident. A roller coaster that left its marks in the form of 3 very different, yet equally iconic, children. The arrival of Meg was the first landmark in this saga, a true test of whether Peter and Lois's marriage was meant to weather the storms of real responsibility. In the lore of Family Guy, Meg's existence feels almost accidental, as though she appeared not because Peter and Lois meticulously planned her, but because their shared naivety and youthful impulses set the stage for a pregnancy neither of them was fully prepared for. Lois, with her traditional upbringing, likely envisioned starting a family as part of her destiny. Yet Peter's haphazard approach to life ensured that whatever came of it would never be straightforward. Meg thus became not only their first child, but also a symbol of the early chaos and uncertainty of their union. It is fascinating to consider that within the canon, Meg's birth story is rarely given the kind of gravitas one might expect. Instead, she is often treated as a mistake, not maliciously, but almost as though she were the unintended byproduct of a love that was too impulsive to slow down. The irony lies in how her existence, born of two parents, stumbling into parenthood without a plan, set the tone for her lifelong role as the family's scapegoat. From the very beginning, she was burdened with the curse of being the Griffin nobody truly wanted, and in some twisted way, this origin reflects the randomness and recklessness of Peter and Lois's relationship in those formative years. And then, of course, came Chris, larger than life, simple-minded, and destined to embody the childlike wonder and obliviousness of Peter himself. Chris's existence seems almost more puzzling than Meg's, for if Meg was the accident that taught Peter and Lois how unprepared they were, then Chris was the conscious decision to repeat the cycle despite the chaos of the first. Was Chris truly planned? That question lingers like a shadow over the lore of the Griffins. One can imagine Lois, weary yet yearning for a complete family, pushing for another child in the hope that things might be different the second time around. Peter, meanwhile, might have simply gone along with it, caught up in the fleeting joys of passion, without fully grasping what another child would entail. The result was Chris, a child who carried Lois's gentle heart but was marked unmistakably by Peter's genetic quirkiness. His presence in the household shifted the dynamics entirely, turning Meg's already precarious position into something more tragic. Suddenly, Meg wasn't just the unwanted firstborn. She was overshadowed by the arrival of a brother whose very simplicity made him more endearing to their parents. Whether intended or not, Chris's existence cemented a dynamic in which Meg was eternally sidelined. But if Meg's and Chris's births carried shades of impulsive chaos and half-hearted intention, then the arrival of Stewie was something altogether different. Stewie's lore is drenched in irony, for while his creation might have followed the same accidental rhythms as his siblings, his character embodies the exact opposite: hyperintelligence, meticulous planning, and an obsession with control. The disconnect between his likely unplanned conception and his carefully calculated personality is what makes his backstory so captivating. One can imagine Peter and Lois by this point in their marriage, exhausted from years of raising two children who seemed to embody the extremes of disappointment and cluelessness, suddenly finding themselves facing the prospect of yet another child. Was Stewie's conception an accident born of routine marital intimacy? Or was it Lois yearning for another chance at motherhood, convincing herself and Peter that a third child might somehow bring balance to their household? Whatever the case, Stewie entered the world not as a unifying force, but as a wild card, a baby whose every action seemed to mock the very randomness of his own existence. The lore becomes even more twisted when one considers that within the show, Stewie is not merely a child, but a force of chaos, whose schemes and diabolical intellect seem out of place in the very family that birthed him. If Meg represents neglect, and Chris represents obliviousness, then Stewie represents defiance, the rebellion against being yet another accident in a family defined by them. His very personality is a rejection of the haphazard way in which he came into the world, as though he is determined to seize control of a destiny his parents never truly intended for him. What makes this exploration even more compelling is the undercurrent of humor and tragedy woven throughout. The Griffin children, for all their comedic absurdities, are also reflections of Peter and Lois's relationship in different stages. Meg is the unplanned beginning, born of passion without preparation. Chris is the flawed attempt at redemption, the hope that this time it will be different. And Stewie is the culmination, the strange byproduct of routine turned ironic destiny. Together, they are less the result of careful family planning and more the scattered remnants of two people stumbling their way through adulthood while clinging to love as the glue that holds them together. And yet, for all the chaos and accidental circumstances, there is still something undeniably human in their story. Parenthood is rarely as deliberate or planned as society imagines it to be. And in the Griffins, this truth is amplified to absurd proportions. The accidents, the half-formed decisions, the late-night mistakes, they all become part of the lore that defines not only Meg, Chris, and Stewie, but also Peter and Lois themselves. Their children are not simply offspring. They are the living evidence of the messy, chaotic, and passionate journey of a marriage that was never perfect, but always authentic in its imperfection. As the story of their children's origins unfolds, it begins to cast a new light on the Griffin household as a whole. Every insult hurled at Meg, every moment of clueless joy from Chris, every diabolical plan hatched by Stewie. They all carry echoes of how they came to be. These aren't just quirks of character. They're extensions of the circumstances of their creation. And through this lens, the Griffin children stop being random, comedic archetypes and become living lore, manifestations of their parents' choices, mistakes, and passions etched into flesh and blood. And as we leave behind the examination of how Meg, Chris, and Stewie came into being, the story of the Griffins doesn't stop at their births. Instead, it continues to evolve, shaped by the ways in which Peter and Lois attempted to balance love, chaos, and responsibility in the years that followed. For the question is no longer simply whether their children were planned or accidental, but how those very origins sculpted their personalities, destinies, and the twisted dynamics of the Griffin household. The Griffin household often carried the weight of choices that were never fully spoken aloud. By the end of it all, it didn't matter whether the decisions had been intentional or spontaneous. What mattered was that they shaped a family that was both fragile and unbreakable at once. Peter and Lois, in their clumsy way, had built something that endured. And though it often looked chaotic from the outside, inside those walls it was held together by threads of passion, regret, desire, and unrelenting humor. As life moved forward, the dynamics within the Griffin home shifted. It wasn't only about Peter's recklessness or Lois's patience anymore. It was about how these two very different souls continuously returned to each other, no matter how far they drifted apart in moments of conflict. Theirs was a bond tested by time, tested by temptation, and tested by the strange rhythm of Quahog itself. But behind that laughter, a deeper truth existed. One woven into every kiss, every argument, and every quiet night where only the hum of the house spoke for them. This was never a story of neat domestic bliss. The Griffins didn't live the kind of life you'd find in picture-perfect sitcoms with tidy resolutions. Instead, what they lived was raw, sometimes messy, and undeniably human. Their intimacy, rarely discussed, but always lingering in the background, was part of what gave their marriage its strange durability. Peter and Lois weren't just partners in the day-to-day grind. They were bound by something deeper, something physical as much as it was emotional. It might be strange to think about cartoon characters in terms of intimacy, yet in Family Guy's world, the boundaries between satire and reality blur constantly. We've seen hints, jokes, and cutaways that pull back the curtain just enough for us to imagine the private world of Peter and Lois. And beneath those punchlines lies the suggestion that their bond was more complex than simple attraction. There was a constant push and pull between indulgence and restraint, pleasure and frustration, comfort and chaos. Lois herself, with her fiery temperament and sharp wit, often seemed to carry the weight of this balance. On the surface, she was the voice of reason, the one who tried to rein Peter in when his antics went too far. But peel back the layers and you could sense a woman who craved something more than just order. Lois wasn't immune to temptation, nor was she uninterested in passion. In fact, she often seemed torn between her stability as a wife and mother and her hunger for excitement, something that bled into the private spaces of her relationship with Peter. Peter, for all his faults, was a man who approached life with reckless abandon. That same recklessness often found its way into their private life, shaping moments that were clumsy but genuine, ridiculous yet affectionate. While the show often played these moments for laughs, there was a deeper undercurrent, a suggestion that Peter and Lois's intimacy was what kept their marriage alive despite the madness of their daily lives. In some ways, it was their anchor, the one space where chaos turned into connection. Their sexual relationship, hinted at countless times throughout the series, was never portrayed as bland or routine. In fact, it was often exaggerated to comical levels, showing just how unusual and unpredictable their dynamic could be. Whether it was Peter's bizarre fantasies or Lois's surprising willingness to indulge in them, these moments hinted at a marriage far from lifeless. Instead, it was a partnership that thrived on unpredictability, on embracing the absurd and turning it into a shared language of affection. But beneath the comedy, there was also a quieter truth. Lois's attraction to Peter often seemed inexplicable on the surface. Why would a woman so intelligent, so composed, tie herself to a man so careless and childish? And yet that attraction was undeniable. Perhaps it was because in Peter, she found something raw, unpolished, and unapologetically free. He offered her a kind of reckless passion that she couldn't find anywhere else, a chaotic spark that ignited her own desires in ways even she didn't always admit. Their intimacy wasn't always smooth, of course. There were frustrations, missteps, and moments where their differences pulled them apart. But what made their bond unique was how often those very differences became the fuel for their connection. Peter's silliness, his unpredictability, and his boundless imagination turned their private life into something Lois could never fully control, but also never fully walk away from. And Lois's fiery nature, her sharpness, and her hidden hunger for adventure kept Peter engaged in ways he could never articulate, but always felt. Together, they created a rhythm, a messy, imperfect, but deeply human rhythm that sustained them through every challenge. It wasn't the kind of intimacy most people would envy, nor was it the kind they'd write about in romantic novels. But it was theirs, uniquely and unapologetically. It was built on laughter, on absurdity, on shared secrets, and unspoken understandings, and it was precisely that intimacy which gave their marriage its strange resilience. If you look closely, you realize that every argument they had, every time Lois scolded Peter or Peter tried to wriggle out of trouble, there was always an undercurrent of affection. Even in their most absurd fights, there was a reminder that this was a couple who, for all their flaws, never stopped being drawn to each other. Their private life was simply another extension of that magnetic pull, one that carried them through every mistake and every reconciliation. And when you think about it, isn't that the heart of every long-lasting relationship? Not perfection, not constant harmony, but the ability to keep returning to each other despite everything. Peter and Lois embodied that idea in the strangest, most cartoonish way possible, but it rang true nonetheless. Beneath the laughter and the chaos, there was a love that endured not because it was easy, but because it was alive. And as the night settles once again over the Griffin home, you can imagine them in those quiet moments when the kids are asleep, when the noise of the day fades away. Behind closed doors, beyond the jokes, there's a connection that's as messy and complicated as life itself. A connection that doesn't ask for perfection, but thrives in imperfection. That, perhaps, is the real secret of Peter and Lois, the truth hidden in plain sight all along. The unsteady partnership between Peter and Lois has always been one of those love stories that looks deceptively simple on the surface, yet holds layers upon layers of complexities when you start peeling it back. Their marriage might seem comedic, messy, and even dysfunctional at times, but under the humor, it tells us a lot about how two drastically different personalities end up fitting together like jagged puzzle pieces. It's in their moments of chaos, in their arguments, and in their reconciliations that you can see just how much they are tied to each other's destiny. Peter, with his reckless, childlike tendencies, and Lois, with her attempt at grounding stability, are the kind of pair that shouldn't work, yet somehow they do. What's fascinating is how often their marriage reveals unspoken truths about relationships in general. That passion and frustration often exist side by side. That laughter and heartbreak can come from the same bond. And that sometimes love survives not because it is perfect, but because it is relentless. Their story isn't about balance. It's about the push and pull. The way Lois anchors Peter while still being swept up in his storms, and the way Peter, despite his immaturity, gives Lois a life of excitement she secretly craves. Nakira, if you look closer, you begin to see that their marriage is not merely comedic fodder, but a mirror reflecting how families are built on contradictions. Peter needs Lois as the voice of reason, even when he fights against her authority. Lois needs Peter to remind her of spontaneity, even when she scolds him for it. And beneath all their quarrels, they both know one unshakable truth. Their lives would feel empty without the other. It's a reminder that family doesn't form out of neatness, but from enduring each other's imperfections. But if marriage has its contradictions, then parenthood adds an entirely new dimension to the Griffins' lore. The moment children entered their lives, the tone of their relationship shifted, sometimes subtly, sometimes with dramatic upheaval. Raising kids didn't just test their patience. It revealed aspects of Peter and Lois that even they hadn't seen in themselves. Parenthood became both a battlefield and a proving ground. Stewie, Chris, and Meg are not just characters who grew up under the Griffin roof. They are embodiments of their parents' decisions, struggles, and impulses. Each child represents a different piece of Peter and Lois's personality, shaped by both intention and accident. In fact, when we look at how the Griffin children came into being, it's worth questioning whether they were truly the result of planning or the chaotic consequence of chance. Meg, for instance, is often portrayed as the unwanted child, someone constantly neglected, belittled, and dismissed. Was she the result of careful family planning? Or was she, in truth, a surprise that Peter and Lois weren't ready for? The way she is treated suggests she became the symbol of burden, a child brought into a home that wasn't fully prepared to nurture her. Yet, ironically, Meg also represents the side of Lois that desperately clings to normalcy and societal expectations. Lois may deny it, but in her heart, Meg is the daughter she once thought she should raise, even if she resents the responsibility now. Then there's Chris, whose existence feels like a mix of accident and half-hearted intention. Chris often embodies Peter's goofiness and lack of awareness, but with an innocence that softens it. He was not exactly planned, but not completely accidental either. He seems to exist in that strange middle ground where desire and carelessness meet. The Griffin household never really prepared for Chris, yet his presence created a unique dynamic that balanced Stewie's intensity and Meg's neglect. Chris, in a way, is proof that even unplanned outcomes can add warmth to a family's chaotic existence. And finally, there's Stewie, the most unusual of them all. His very being suggests that he was more than an accident, yet less than a careful plan. He embodies Lois's suppressed ambitions and Peter's reckless energy, wrapped into a child who feels too brilliant, too calculated, to have been the result of simple chance. Was he conceived as an afterthought, or was there a hidden, deeper desire for another child? That mystery adds to his allure. Unlike Meg or Chris, Stewie feels like fate's intervention, a child who arrived to reshape the Griffin household with his presence, forcing his parents into new roles and dynamics they could never have imagined. When you step back and look at the bigger picture, the Griffin children are living testaments to how messy, unpredictable, and strangely beautiful family creation can be. Whether by accident or design, they reflect Peter and Lois's flawed humanity. And that, perhaps, is what makes the Griffin family so strangely relatable. Their existence was never about careful construction, but about navigating the unpredictable consequences of love, desire, and mistakes. The lore surrounding how each child came into being often shifts depending on the episode, sometimes contradicting itself, sometimes leaning into absurdity, but beneath the comedy is a powerful truth. Very few families are created out of perfection. Instead, they come into being through impulsive choices, unexpected moments, and the resilience of two people trying to make it work, despite themselves. Peter and Lois never intended for Parenthood to be neat. Their family is more like a messy canvas where paint has been splattered without precision. Yet, when you step back, you realize there's a strange, chaotic masterpiece taking shape. The children may not have been meticulously planned, but each of them forced Peter and Lois to confront parts of themselves they couldn't ignore. And so the Griffin household became both a sanctuary and a battlefield, a place where love, resentment, laughter, and dysfunction collide every day. It's not a perfect family, but then again, no family truly is. The Griffins remind us that it's not about how carefully you plan children or relationships. It's about what you do when life hands them to you anyway. This theme, the tension between planning and chaos, echoes throughout their story, adding depth to every argument, every bonding moment, and every comedic misstep. What makes the Griffins unforgettable isn't that they're flawless, but that their flaws are lived out openly, absurdly, and sometimes painfully, in a way that reflects real families more than we'd like to admit. And as we peel back the layers of this family's history, we begin to see how each moment of spontaneity, every so-called accident, and every chaotic twist has defined who they are. The children may not have been part of a grand plan, but their existence carved out a destiny for Peter and Lois, one where their love, for all its turbulence, found its meaning in the lives they created together. It's one thing to see Peter and Lois as partners in the public eye, clumsy but devoted, navigating the everyday chaos of Quahog. But when you peel back the surface, when you step into the quieter corners of their home life, you begin to see another dimension of their marriage, one that thrives in secrecy, one that pulses beneath the humdrum arguments about bills, chores, or Peter's next harebrained scheme. That dimension is their intimacy, their sex life, which in many ways has been the unspoken glue of their relationship. Peter may come off as the goofy, overweight husband who doesn't always think things through, but behind closed doors, in moments when the world isn't watching, there's a surprisingly deep current of passion that defines his bond with Lois. For Lois, who once lived a life of privilege as the daughter of Carter and Babs Pewterschmidt, her relationship with Peter has always represented a rebellion. He wasn't the man her parents would have chosen, nor the man she was groomed to marry. He was the wild card, the unpredictable force who brought chaos into her otherwise orderly life. And part of that chaos, part of what hooked her and kept her coming back, was the sheer unpredictability of their intimacy. From their earliest days together, Peter and Lois's physical relationship carried an intensity that went far beyond polite affection. It wasn't just about attraction. It was about the thrill of being with someone who was utterly different. Lois, who had been surrounded by stiff, well-bred men, found in Peter an energy she couldn't resist. He was brash, sometimes even crude, but he was also free. He made her laugh when she wasn't supposed to, made her feel things she wasn't supposed to feel, and gave her an escape from the carefully curated world of wealth and manners she had grown up in. Over time, that physical bond became their shared language, a way of connecting when words failed them. Arguments could be smoothed over by passion, stress dissolved through intimacy, and sometimes their sex life was the only space where Peter's immaturity actually worked in his favor. Because in that space, his lack of inhibition wasn't a liability, it was a strength. He was willing to try, to play, to be spontaneous in a way that Lois secretly craved. Family Guy has hinted more than once at the unusual depth of their intimacy. Lois has been portrayed as a woman with a fiery side, someone whose desires run deep, even when she's outwardly performing the role of the dutiful suburban wife. Jokes about her adventurous streak are peppered throughout the series, references to role-play costumes, or even wild fantasies she harbors. And Peter, while often portrayed as clueless, seems to match her energy when it comes to their bedroom life. Beneath the bumbling exterior, there's a man who genuinely thrills Lois, sometimes in ways that defy expectations. And this, in turn, became an essential anchor for their marriage. Their intimacy wasn't perfect. There were arguments, mismatches, moments when one of them wanted more than the other. But for all of their dysfunction, for all of the yelling and misunderstandings, the bedroom remained a space where they found balance. It was here, in the privacy of their shared world, that the contradictions of their relationship made sense. Lois's refined upbringing and Peter's wild impulsiveness met in a place where they didn't have to pretend. This is part of why their sex life isn't just a background detail. It's a character in their story. It explains why Lois stayed when she could have left, why Peter fought to keep her when he might have been too lazy to fight for anything else. Their physical connection carried a gravitational pull that tied them together, even when everything else seemed to be pushing them apart. But intimacy, especially in a marriage as messy as theirs, has never been free of complications. There were times when Lois's desires pushed her into morally gray territory. Moments when temptation crept into her life in ways that tested her loyalty. The series has dropped hints of her wandering eye, her flirtations with other men, even outright affairs and certain cutaway gags or alternative storylines. Yet time and time again, she circles back to Peter. Not because he's the ideal man, not because he fulfills every fantasy, but because their connection is irreplaceable. Peter himself, while often oblivious, has also had his share of temptations. But here's the truth. For all the ridiculous situations he stumbles into, for all the strippers, scandals, and outrageous scenarios, he never seems to stray far from Lois for long. She is, in a strange way, his center of gravity, the one constant in his otherwise chaotic life. Their sex life isn't just about passion. It's about reaffirming that bond, a physical reminder of why they chose each other in the first place. It's also worth noting how this dynamic shaped the household itself. Their children, though often the butt of jokes in the series, are in many ways products of that passion. Stewie, with his hyper-intelligence and odd tendencies, Meg with her desperate yearning for affection, and Chris with his bumbling sweetness. They're all reflections of parents who, for all their flaws, built a family rooted not in meticulous planning, but in raw, unfiltered passion. And this brings us to an intriguing question, one that hovers in the background whenever you peel back the lore of the Griffins. Were these children accidents, happy surprises, or carefully planned additions to their lives? Because if you trace back through the timeline, the answers aren't as straightforward as one might expect. Lois's fiery intimacy with Peter explains the inevitability of children, but it also raises curiosity about whether each child was truly meant to be, or whether they were simply the byproducts of a marriage that was driven more by passion than meticulous forethought. The humor of Family Guy often leans into this ambiguity. Stewie, in particular, seems almost like an accident that became destiny. A child so unusual that he feels less like a planned addition and more like the chaotic outcome of two people who never stopped surprising each other. Chris, with his innocence, and Meg, with her outsider status, feel similarly like results of a household where passion preceded planning. But before we explore that question, before we unravel whether the Griffin children were accidents, blessings, or deliberate choices, it's worth lingering a little longer on the foundation itself. Because the truth is, Peter and Lois's sex life isn't just an amusing side note or a comedic device. It's the hidden pulse of their marriage, the one area where they defy the expectations others place on them. To her parents, Lois's choice of Peter was a disgrace, a deviation from the Pewterschmidt legacy. To the outside world, Peter is the kind of husband most people would dismiss as incompetent. But to Lois, in the intimacy they share, he is the one man who keeps her alive, the one man who makes her feel as though life is worth breaking rules for. And in that sense, their sex life isn't just private. It's political, emotional, and deeply personal. It explains the resilience of their bond, the survival of their marriage, and the existence of the Griffin family as a whole. It's a reminder that passion, no matter how messy, can be the strongest thread binding two people together. And it's that very passion, chaotic and unpredictable, that leads us directly into the next stage of their story, the arrival of their children. Because whether planned or not, whether welcomed or accidental, each child represents not just the union of Peter and Lois, but the continuation of a bond that has endured in the most unconventional ways imaginable. And so, within the folds of this domestic reality, Lois began to carry both the joy and the weight of what her role had come to mean. She was the anchor of the household, the one who cleaned up after Peter's chaos, the one who softened his failures with patience, and the one who nurtured each child into their own strange, unique identity. But alongside this responsibility came the constant struggle of her inner self, the young woman who once had dreams of art, of music, of exploring the world beyond Quahog. Now she measured her life in grocery lists, PTA meetings, laundry baskets, and the unpredictable rhythm of Peter's antics. Yet it was within this constant push and pull that her story gained its depth. For Lois Griffin was never a one-dimensional figure. never just a suburban wife on autopilot. She was a woman balancing love, duty, and desire, all while standing beside a man who rarely realized how much she sacrificed for him. The heart of Lois's narrative is tied to Peter, but it's not defined solely by him. It's important to understand that her journey of love was not just about passion and romance. It was also about how two flawed people learned to coexist in a world that rarely offered them peace. Their relationship was a constant negotiation, and while it might have appeared chaotic, that chaos carried a strange intimacy of its own. Take, for example, the quieter moments that Family Guy often glosses over. The way Lois and Peter would sit on the couch late at night, the kids asleep, the house finally quiet. Peter might be rambling about some wild idea he had, like starting a business or buying something absurd, and Lois would just smile, roll her eyes, and listen. To outsiders, it might look like she was tolerating him, but underneath, it was the portrait of a woman who loved her husband, not for what he achieved, but for his very essence, the way he made her laugh, the way he reminded her, in his strange, childlike manner, of what it meant to live without constantly overthinking. Yet love in their marriage was never confined to the soft gestures. It was messy, it was loud, and at times it was even uncomfortable. Lois, despite her refined upbringing, often leaned into Peter's reckless side. She wasn't just a victim of his chaos. She sometimes embraced it, indulged in it, even encouraged it. She might scold him for a ridiculous plan, but more often than not, she ended up being part of it, swept along into the absurdity. Their love wasn't about balance in the conventional sense. It was about two people constantly tipping the scale and somehow never letting it break. Still, the cracks were there. In certain episodes, the audience glimpses the frustration that builds within Lois, the exhaustion of being the emotional caretaker, the financial stabilizer, and the moral compass of the family. There were times when she fantasized about different lives, other men, other possibilities, other outcomes. And yet, in every scenario, the gravitational pull of Peter brought her back. Theirs was not a love story of perfection. It was a love story of persistence. And perhaps that persistence is what makes Lois so compelling. She is at once the traditional sitcom wife archetype and the subversion of it. She scolds Peter like Lucy scolded Ricky, but she also finds herself drawn into his chaos in ways that blur the line between discipline and desire. And it's in this blurred space that the audience senses something more intimate, something rarely spoken of outright, the private layer of their marriage, the one that exists when the children are asleep and the house is silent. Because beyond the jokes, beyond the cutaway gags, beyond the slapstick of their day-to-day lives, Peter and Lois share a physical intimacy that cements their bond in a way no argument or mishap ever could. For all the chaos of their marriage, their passion for each other is undeniable. Lois, who could have easily distanced herself from Peter's antics, instead found herself tethered by the physical spark that kept their love alive. It wasn't just emotional, it was visceral. In many ways, this physical connection was the glue holding them together. For every argument about bills, for every frustration with Peter's irresponsibility, there was always the unspoken knowledge that when they were alone, stripped of distractions, they rediscovered each other in ways words could not describe. It was not always tender, it was often fiery, unexpected, even comical in its own right. But it was real, and in that reality, Lois found both a release and a reminder. This man, for all his flaws, was hers, and she was his. There are countless instances within the show where this element of their relationship bleeds through, hinted at with humor, but carrying undertones of truth. Whether it's Lois openly acknowledging Peter's ability to surprise her in the bedroom, or Peter boasting with a mix of pride and cluelessness, the message remains clear. Theirs is not a cold marriage, nor one sustained purely by duty. Their physical bond is a vital part of the chaos and the affection that defines them. This aspect of their love story also adds a fascinating layer to Lois's character. Despite her composed exterior, despite her role as the responsible one, Lois is not immune to desire. In fact, she embraces it with a boldness that defies the stereotype of the suburban housewife. She is passionate, adventurous, and unafraid to admit that part of what keeps her tethered to Peter is the undeniable chemistry they share behind closed doors. And this, too, deepens the understanding of why Lois stays, why she endures Peter's schemes, his failures, his impulsive decisions. It's not simply love in the abstract. It's the tangible reality of a bond that exists on multiple levels, emotional, physical, and even chaotic. Together, they built the rhythm that might look dysfunctional to the outside world, but to them, it was the very thing that kept the Griffin family alive. This is where their marriage stands apart from so many others portrayed in animation. It's not sanitized, it's not polished, and it's certainly not picture perfect. It's messy, passionate, flawed, and real. And in that reality, Lois's role becomes all the more complex. Not just the voice of reason, not just the caretaker, but also a woman who allows herself to indulge in the unpredictable passion of the man she married. As the years rolled on, this duality only grew stronger. Lois might sigh in exasperation at Peter's antics, but the truth is, part of her craved the very unpredictability that came with him. Their intimacy wasn't a retreat from the chaos of their lives, it was part of it. Another reflection of the energy that kept them bound together. And so, when looking at Peter and Lois, it becomes clear that their love story is not just about surviving the storm, but about finding ways to dance within it. And in that dance, passion and frustration were never separate. They were intertwined, inseparable, and essential. And that's where we see the Griffin household in its most unpolished and yet revealing state. Underneath all the banter, the quirks, and the dysfunction lies a real question that lingers in the background of their family dynamic. How exactly did these children come into being? Were they born out of meticulous planning, the result of thoughtful conversations between Peter and Lois about when to start a family? Or were they the surprising, chaotic accidents that so many sitcom families eventually laugh off? To answer that, we need to sift through both the canon of the show and the deeper layers of Family Guy lore, where reality and exaggeration often blur into one another. Starting with Meg, the oldest of the Griffin children, the circumstances of her birth carry with them the air of both inevitability and miscalculation. Lois was relatively young, still basking in the early days of her relationship with Peter, and while she had her ambitions and social standing to think about, life had other plans. Some interpretations suggest that Lois and Peter genuinely wanted Meg, that she was their chance to anchor themselves as a true family after the wild uncertainties of early married life. But the show never quite frames her that way, does it? Instead, Meg's presence often feels like the reminder of obligations that came sooner than expected. She represents that transitional period where a couple shifts from lovers to parents, and the lore tends to hint that while she wasn't necessarily a complete accident, she wasn't fully a part of some grand life blueprint either. There's something quietly tragic about that when you think about it. Meg, often overlooked and mistreated, might carry with her the unspoken weight of being the child who arrived at the wrong time, or perhaps before Peter and Lois were fully ready. And that becomes part of the lore, that her very existence in the Griffin household was a catalyst that forced her parents to confront adulthood in ways they weren't entirely prepared for. Then comes Chris, and here the story gets even more interesting. Chris's birth has long been teased within the show as one of those oops moments, yet one layered with affection. The Griffin household, by the time Chris was born, was already used to the routine of raising one child. Lois, with her maternal instincts, might have seen Chris as a natural next step, but Peter, being Peter, probably wasn't consciously thinking about expanding the family. The lore suggests that Chris was less about intentional planning and more about the kind of spontaneity that happens when two people, despite their chaos, genuinely care for each other. What sets Chris apart in this narrative is that he embodies a strange kind of middle ground between mistake and miracle. On the one hand, he seems to be the product of timing that wasn't carefully mapped out. On the other, his presence adds a certain balance to the Griffin home. He's not just a spare part of the family. He's often portrayed as the one who unknowingly absorbs much of Peter's quirks and innocence, while also inheriting Lois's grounding presence. In lore terms, Chris's arrival represents the Griffin household settling into its role as a true nuclear family, even if they didn't entirely mean for it to happen. And finally, we come to Stewie, the most enigmatic, the most peculiar, and certainly the most debated of the Griffin children when it comes to his origins. The very idea of Stewie being planned seems almost laughable when you consider the chaos he brings with him. His advanced intelligence, his bizarre personality, his penchant for violence and scheming, it all feels too fantastical, too out of the ordinary to be the result of any carefully timed parenting choice. But then again, isn't that the beauty of Stewie's character? He's the wild card, the unexpected turn that reshapes the entire Griffin household. According to some interpretations of Family Guy lore, Stewie's birth wasn't just an accident, but almost a cosmic joke, a reflection of what happens when Peter and Lois, in the midst of an already unsteady dynamic, decide to let life take its course. Some episodes hint that Lois may have been more intentional about him, perhaps hoping another child would round out the family, but Peter's lack of foresight makes it unlikely he contributed much thought to the decision. And yet, Stewie arrives bringing with him not just the role of baby of the family, but an entire narrative of absurdity and brilliance that becomes central to the show. The fascinating part of this lore-driven exploration is how the children's origins seem to reflect Peter and Lois's relationship at different stages. Meg ties into their early marriage, full of new responsibilities and perhaps rushed decisions. Chris represents the middle stage, where routine has settled in, but spontaneity still shapes the household. And Stewie, as the youngest, becomes a symbol of their most chaotic, unfiltered selves, a byproduct of a couple who by then were less concerned about control and more resigned to letting life be messy. But beyond the surface-level humor and dysfunction, there's a deeper question lurking in the narrative. What does it mean that these children might not have been fully planned? Does it make them less loved? Or does it, in some strange way, make them more authentic, more real as a family? After all, life rarely unfolds according to schedule, and the Griffins, for all their exaggeration, might just represent the reality that family is often built in the unexpected. It's worth noting, too, how the show occasionally teases this idea through Peter's offhand jokes or Lois's fleeting moments of honesty. Every so often, you'll catch a line about how something just happened or how we weren't expecting that. Those moments, tucked between the comedy, are windows into the lore that say more than the gags ever could. They tell us that behind the jokes, behind the chaos, the Griffin children are not just characters. They're embodiments of a relationship navigating the unpredictable course of life. And when you frame it like that, their so-called accidental origins become less about mistakes and more about destiny. Each child, whether planned or not, brings with them a role that reshapes the household in ways Peter and Lois couldn't have possibly imagined. Meg forces them into adulthood. Chris balances the family with his innocence, and Stewie turns the household into a stage where absurdity and genius coexist. This is where the Griffin lore becomes truly fascinating, because it's not just about how the children came into being, but about what their births symbolize in the broader narrative of Peter and Lois's marriage. They are not mere byproducts of their parents' choices or lack thereof, but integral parts of the ongoing story, each arrival marking a new chapter in the unpredictable saga of the Griffin family. And that unpredictability is what makes them so enduring. In a world where sitcom families often follow predictable arcs, the Griffins stand out precisely because their children weren't born of perfect timing or meticulous planning. They were born of chaos, chance, and the messy reality of love, and somehow that makes them feel more real. And so when you look at the Griffin children, each one seems to reflect a different stage of Peter and Lois's relationship. A stage where passion, routine, or even sheer chaos defined how life unfolded in their small New England home. But behind the humor and the exaggerated cartoon logic, there lingers a subtle question. Were these lives shaped by choice, or by the unpredictable tides of circumstance? To answer that, we need to look deeper into how the family's foundation wove itself together over time, and how the arrival of each child didn't just change Peter and Lois's household, but redefined who they were as individuals and as partners. Meg, as the eldest, stands as the most telling example. She was born during a period when Peter and Lois were still clinging to the idea of what a conventional life should look like. The decision, or accident, depending on how you interpret the show's shifting timeline, wasn't just about bringing a child into the world. It was about cementing themselves as a normal family. Meg's existence is almost symbolic of Lois's yearning for stability, something she perhaps hoped Peter would grow into. Yet Peter remained Peter, chaotic, unpredictable, often childish himself. That disconnect is what made Meg's upbringing particularly fraught. She became the anchor, the reminder of responsibility. And as the years rolled on, the rest of the family treated her less as a cherished figure and more as the scapegoat for their dysfunction. But then came Chris. If Meg symbolized stability, Chris seemed to embody the second act of their marital narrative, the stage where passion and whim collided without much planning. Unlike Meg, Chris doesn't carry the same undertones of Lois's vision of family order. He feels more like the natural result of Peter and Lois embracing life without worrying too much about the consequences. The humor of Chris's existence lies in his uncanny similarity to Peter, both in appearance and behavior. It's as if nature decided to poke fun at Lois, reminding her of the man she chose, doubling down by placing a miniature Peter into her arms. That resemblance often highlights the strange irony of their marriage. Lois wanted structure, yet she continuously fell deeper into a life of absurdity because of the very man she tied herself to. Chris's role within the family, then, isn't just about being a child. It's about being a mirror, a living reflection of Peter's influence on the family dynamic. And then there's Stewie. His arrival shifts the narrative again, almost as though he was never really meant to be part of the plan. Stewie is the child who transforms the Griffins from a dysfunctional sitcom family into a vessel for absurdist, surreal storytelling. If Meg was order and Chris was consequence, then Stewie is chaos, He feels like the embodiment of what happens when passion collides with fatigue, when a marriage that has already endured years of unpredictability suddenly finds itself with one more curveball. The sheer extremity of his personality, the plotting, the intellect, the sinister baby genius persona, reflects how far removed Lois and Peter's reality had become from the original vision Lois once held. The show often teases the idea that Stewie wasn't planned in the traditional sense, and that adds another layer to the family's mythology. His existence feels accidental, like a byproduct of Peter and Lois's inability to ever truly settle into a neat, controlled lifestyle. And yet Stewie's presence adds a richness to the story that Meg and Chris alone couldn't provide. He injects a dramatic irony into the family. The parents may be oblivious or careless, but this baby sees the world with unnerving clarity. It's almost as if Stewie exists to comment on the very nature of his own creation. Taken together, the children reflect the unpredictable journey of Peter and Lois's relationship. None of them really feel like the result of a carefully laid out family plan. Instead, they seem like narrative checkpoints, moments where Peter and Lois's love, lust, or lapses in judgment left behind a permanent reminder. This isn't to say they weren't wanted. On some level, each child represents a part of their bond that Peter and Lois did hold dear. But the way the show frames it, there's always an undercurrent of absurdity, suggesting that in the Griffin household, accidents and intentions blur until you can't quite tell the difference. This ambiguity is what makes the lore of the Griffins so fascinating. Unlike many animated sitcom families where children appear static and almost timeless, the Griffins are presented in a way that makes their existence feel tangled in the messy reality of adulthood. You can almost imagine Lois staring at her life in quiet moments, wondering how much of this was truly her choice and how much of it was the inevitable chaos of being with Peter. She once dreamed of refinement, of stability, perhaps even of a life that wouldn't spiral into slapstick chaos. But then came Peter, and with him came a future filled with loud laughs, bruising mistakes, and 3 children who each embody the contradictions of their love. It's in these quiet implications that the Griffin lore takes on a darker, more poignant edge. Every joke about Meg's mistreatment, every gag about Chris' cluelessness, every surreal cutaway featuring Stewie's violent ambitions, it all speaks to a deeper truth about the unpredictable nature of family. Sometimes children are planned. Sometimes they're the result of passion or accidents. But always they leave their mark, reshaping the lives of those who brought them into the world. In Peter and Lois's case, the children didn't just reshape their lives, they became the defining elements of their entire existence. Without them, they'd just be another mismatched couple bumbling through adulthood. With them, they are the Griffins, a family as hilariously broken as they are strangely enduring. And that's the heart of the matter. Whether by accident or intent, whether through passion or folly, the Griffin children are the living evidence of how messy, unpredictable, and oddly enduring Peter and Lois's relationship has been. They are both the greatest gift and the most overwhelming responsibility, a paradox that defines the family's ongoing story. But the deeper question lingers still. If their children were the products of such chaotic circumstances, how has that chaos shaped the way Peter and Lois see themselves as parents, partners, and individuals? To answer that, we have to peel back another layer of the Griffin household's complex lore to see not just how the children came into being, but how raising them transformed Peter and Lois in ways neither of them ever anticipated. It was in that reflection of chaos and comfort where the foundation of their family truly sat. an uneven balance that somehow always managed to hold together, no matter how fragile it seemed. And as much as Peter and Lois may have laughed about it, argued about it, or even ignored it, that fragile balance shaped not only their marriage, but the very fabric of what the Griffin household became. Yet to fully understand that dynamic, one must look at the children themselves, not as isolated characters, but as living, breathing embodiments of their parents' choices, their flaws, their passions, and their mistakes. The Griffins, after all, were not simply Peter and Lois anymore. They had multiplied into three very different reflections of their parents, and with each child came another layer of lore that deepened the story of this family. Meg was the first, the accidental mirror of what it meant for Peter and Lois to stumble into parenthood before they were truly ready. She wasn't planned with starry-eyed dreams or carefully laid-out visions of family life. Meg was the byproduct of youthful recklessness, mixed with the kind of suburban routine that demanded results. She grew up in the shadow of Peter's immaturity and Lois's attempts to balance control with exhaustion. And though Meg would one day wear the scars of neglect and mockery, her very existence marked the beginning of the Griffin family as we know it. She was the first piece in a puzzle that neither Peter nor Lois knew how to finish. But after Meg came Chris, and Chris represented something different entirely. If Meg was born out of accident and uncertainty, Chris was born out of a kind of resigned acceptance. By then, Peter and Lois had already realized that family life wasn't going to be glamorous, that bills were never ending, and that the rhythm of life in Quahog was both suffocating and strangely comforting. Chris came into being in that haze of surrender, where love was present, yes, but tangled with fatigue, obligations, and the sense that one child had already rewritten the rules of their marriage. Chris's presence became a living reminder that parenthood wasn't temporary, it was permanent, and it was relentless. And through Chris, that permanence began to shape the way Peter and Lois functioned as a team, even if their teamwork often looked more like a slapstick routine than an idealized partnership. And then came Stewie. If Meg was an accident and Chris was acceptance, then Stewie was something else entirely. He was the force of nature. The child who seemed less like a baby and more like an otherworldly projection of every suppressed thought, fear, and secret desire that had existed in the household. He wasn't just the youngest child. He was the Griffin family's subconscious brought to life. And in his words, his schemes, his violent fantasies, and his intellectual arrogance, you could almost hear the unspoken conversations between Peter and Lois. Was he their creation, or was he their curse? Or perhaps both at once? Stewie was more than a child. He was living lore, a reminder that in the world of the Griffins, nothing was ever simple. To understand how each child came into being is to understand Peter and Lois on a deeper level. Their sex life, their decisions, their impulses, and even their failures were written into the DNA of Meg, Chris, and Stewie. And though the show often brushes these realities aside with jokes or gags, the deeper narrative becomes clear when you look beyond the laughter. Each Griffin child was born at a crossroads in their parents' lives, a moment when passion, chaos, or exhaustion dictated the path forward, and each one of them became a symbol of what Peter and Lois were willing or unwilling to face. It's easy to see Meg as the mistake. The first child often is in stories like these. She became the forgotten one, the outcast, the punching bag not only for her peers, but for her own family. And yet within her story is the truth of what it means for two people to stumble into parenthood before they're emotionally equipped. Lois tried to shape Meg into something proper, refined, and capable. perhaps as a way of correcting her own mistakes. Peter, on the other hand, often projected his insecurities onto her, mocking her as though tearing her down might somehow build himself up. But through it all, Meg's presence in the household carried weight. She represented the vulnerability of their marriage, the imperfections they could never hide, and the uncomfortable truth that love sometimes fails the very people it's supposed to protect. Chris, however, was not the mistake. He was the surrender. His existence showed that Peter and Lois had reached a point where the chaos was no longer shocking. It was normal. Chris carried the legacy of a family that had already begun to spiral into dysfunction. Yet within his simplicity and his gentle, if dim-witted nature, there was something deeply human. He embodied the soft underbelly of the Griffin household, the innocence that still lingered in the face of constant madness. Chris was the child who showed that even within a broken system, love could exist. Not perfect love, not noble love, but the kind of love that survives despite itself. And Stewie, well, Stewie was the ultimate accident and the ultimate design all at once. His existence was more than just another child in the Griffin line. He was the surreal embodiment of everything that Peter and Lois had created together. Their dysfunction, their suppressed desires, their chaotic impulses, and their endless cycle of destruction and reconciliation. He was the Griffin household's mirror, sharper and more dangerous than any of his siblings. In him, you could see both the mistakes of Peter's immaturity and the ambitions of Lois's suppressed intellect. He was a paradox, the child who seemed planned by the universe, even if his parents never truly planned him themselves. And so, as the Griffin children grew, the household evolved. No longer just a husband and wife, Peter and Lois had become leaders of a chaotic empire, one that reflected their choices with every passing day. Meg, Chris, and Stewie weren't just kids. They were stories written in flesh and bone, narratives born out of passion, accident, fatigue, and fate. To understand them is to understand the Griffins at their core, because, in the end, family is never just about who you marry. It's about what you create together, for better or worse. And it was in that creation that the Griffins revealed their truest lore. Not the wild adventures, not the exaggerated gags, but the quiet truth hidden behind the laughter. That family is messy, unplanned, imperfect, and yet, in its own strange way, eternal. Peter and Lois's family dynamic, with its blend of chaos, dysfunction, and genuine love, always raised an important question. Were their children ever part of a grand plan, or were they simply the result of wild nights, heated passion, and the unpredictable nature of their relationship? To understand that, one has to return to the origin stories of Meg, Chris, and Stewie, each child bringing their own kind of lore to the Griffin household. And as is often the case with Family Guy, the truth seems to lie somewhere between happy accidents and ill-prepared parenthood. Meg, the eldest, was the first true test of Peter and Lois's union. Her arrival wasn't greeted with the same kind of planning you might expect from a young married couple. Instead, Meg seemed to come into being as a natural outcome of Peter and Lois's fiery intimacy. If Lois represented a steady, determined side, Peter represented impulsivity and recklessness. Put the two together, and it wasn't long before the quiet nights in Quahog gave way to the loud cries of a newborn. Lois, always the responsible one, tried to see Meg's birth as a blessing, as the true beginning of their family. Peter, however, wasn't quite ready for fatherhood. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him harder than he'd expected. And yet, as with everything else in his life, he somehow found humor in it all. Meg's existence wasn't meticulously plotted out. She was, in many ways, the embodiment of youthful recklessness. Still, Lois embraced motherhood with a kind of natural grace, devoting herself to making sure her daughter had the nurturing foundation she herself had grown up with. Yet looking back, it's easy to see how the Griffin household was never destined to be the picture-perfect family. Meg's life was shaped by Peter's constant blunders, his careless words, and the chaos he often brought into their home. And while Meg often became the butt of the family's jokes, her origin was rooted in passion, an unfiltered and imperfect kind of love that brought her into the world. Chris, on the other hand, represented a different stage in Peter and Lois's lives. By the time he was conceived, the couple had already weathered the storm of early marriage and the challenges of raising a daughter. Yet Peter's impulsive nature hadn't changed much. Chris's arrival often raises the question of whether he was planned or simply another Griffin accident. The truth, perhaps, lies in Lois's quiet acceptance and Peter's typical inability to think ahead. Their intimacy remained fiery, and their nights together, though chaotic, carried a sense of inevitability. Chris was the product of routine passion rather than strategic planning, a child born into a household still struggling to balance love with dysfunction. Where Meg symbolized the shock of entering parenthood, Chris symbolized the acceptance of it. Peter, though still the same irresponsible man-child in many ways, began to settle into the idea of being a father. He wasn't good at it, far from it, but he carried on with the same bumbling charm that defined his life. Lois, meanwhile, seemed resigned to the idea that her family would never look like the picture-perfect household she'd seen growing up. Instead, she accepted that her role was to hold the Griffin family together, no matter how ridiculous or absurd their daily lives became. Chris's presence only deepened that commitment, reminding Lois of the balance she constantly had to strike between being a mother, a wife, and a woman navigating the chaos of Peter's antics. And then, of course, there was Stewie. Unlike Meg and Chris, Stewie was born into a different version of Peter and Lois's relationship. By this time, the spark of their passion hadn't dimmed, but it had taken on a more unpredictable tone. Their sex life, still charged with the same fire that had carried them through years of marriage, remained a constant, though often chaotic, thread in their story. Stewie's existence feels like both a continuation of that passion and a kind of cosmic accident, a reminder that the Griffins never operated under traditional notions of family planning. Stewie's arrival was marked by more than just the usual chaos of parenthood. From the very beginning, he brought with him an entirely new energy. His intelligence, his ambitions, his bizarre fixation on world domination, all of it set him apart from his siblings. While Meg and Chris embodied the familiar challenges of parenting, Stewie introduced something more profound. He became not just a baby, but a central force in the Griffin household's mythology. His origin reflected the wild, almost surreal energy of Peter and Lois's marriage, a child who seemed to embody both the absurdity and the brilliance of the world he was born into. And yet, even with Stewie's extraordinary nature, one truth remained. His conception, like his siblings before him, wasn't the result of meticulous planning. Peter and Lois's sex life, passionate and reckless, dictated much of the Griffin family's future. Each child seemed less like a calculated step forward and more like a natural consequence of their fiery connection. Meg, Chris, and Stewie weren't meticulously plotted characters in their parents' lives. They were, in many ways, the embodiment of everything messy and unplanned about the Griffin marriage. This raises a fascinating point about the Griffin family lore. Are they the result of destiny or simply chaos? Was there a deeper plan at play, or were Peter and Lois simply swept along by the tides of passion and impulse? Looking at their family as a whole, it's difficult to ignore the sense that their children were always meant to be. Even if Peter and Lois didn't know it themselves, each child brought something unique, shaping not only the Griffin household, but the entire mythology of Family Guy. Meg's struggles with acceptance, Chris's innocence and simplicity, Stewie's brilliance and ambition, all of these qualities came together to form a family dynamic unlike any other. And while Peter and Lois may not have plotted out the exact moment each child would arrive, their union created the foundation for all of it. Their sex life, their arguments, their passion, their chaos, it all fed into the story of their children. It's also worth noting that Peter and Lois's inability to plan properly is, in many ways, the heart of their story. They are not the type of couple who operates with precision. Instead, they stumble through life, making mistakes, learning lessons, and somehow holding everything together despite the odds. Their children weren't born out of careful thought. They were born out of love, lust, and the unpredictability of human connection. And perhaps that's what makes their family dynamic so compelling. It's imperfect, it's chaotic, and yet it's real. When we peel back the layers of Family Guy's humor and absurdity, what emerges is a story about a couple who, despite their flaws, built a family together. Peter and Lois didn't plan every step, but they navigated it all with their own unique blend of dysfunction and devotion. Their children, each a product of their fiery bond, reflect that in their own ways. And while Peter may joke about accidents and Lois may sigh about poor planning, the truth is that every Griffin child carries with them the undeniable mark of their parents' chaotic love story. The Griffin family, then, becomes a reflection of life itself, messy, unpredictable, but filled with moments of passion and meaning. And as Meg, Chris, and Stewie grew into their roles within this household, they carried forward the legacy of a marriage that was never perfect, but always somehow enough. And so, with Peter and Lois's story of deliberate choices and happy accidents lingering in the air, the family dynamic turns into something far larger than just the arrival of one child after another. It becomes the story of a household that has grown into a living, breathing ecosystem, where every new addition has reshaped the rhythm of life inside the Griffin home. Each birth, each stage of development, each subtle shift in dynamics has left a permanent mark, and now it's worth stepping into the softer, quieter undercurrents that define what family means in Quahog, far beyond just the headline moments of pregnancy or newborn cries. Because in a place like Spooner Street, the Griffin home is more than walls and rooms. It's a hub of emotional currents, chaotic exchanges, fragile hopes, and the occasional outburst that shakes the very floorboards. And yet, beneath it all, there is something enduring, the bond of people thrown together not by chance alone, but by shared history, laughter, and sometimes even heartache. This segment isn't just about telling the tale of who came into being. It's about what it meant once they were here, what it meant to be part of a household that's equal parts love and madness. The kitchen is one of the best places to begin this exploration. After all, kitchens in the Griffin household are more than spaces for food. They're theaters for confessions, comedic blunders, and moments of raw honesty. How many times has Lois stood over the stove talking to Meg or Chris in that way mothers do, half distracted by a boiling pot, half laser-focused on trying to get through to her children? It's here that the Griffin identity takes shape. through awkward breakfasts where Peter rambles on about nonsensical dreams, through hurried school mornings where Stewie secretly plots between spoonfuls of mashed peas, and through the quiet nights where the clinking of dishes becomes a background score to family conversations. The kitchen table in particular becomes almost like a stage set. Every family has one. The spot where news is delivered, punishments are handed out, and bonding either blossoms or breaks under the weight of argument. Peter slamming his fist in mock authority, Lois shaking her head in patient exasperation, Meg sulking in silence, Chris chuckling at something nobody else finds funny, and Stewie smirking with that detached superiority. Around this table, you can trace the map of their relationships. Who listens, who ignores, who interrupts, and who quietly takes in more than they ever admit. But beyond the kitchen, the living room offers another type of intimacy. The living room in the Griffin household is cluttered with signs of life. The worn sofa where Peter snores during television binges. The coffee table, often strewn with magazines and forgotten snacks. The floor occasionally scattered with Stewie's toys. It's in this space where moments of connection sneak in without the family realizing it. Think of Peter and Lois collapsing on the couch after a long day, shoulders brushing, conversations turning soft and meandering, away from the loud theatrics of their daily lives. Or Meg and Chris, siblings who seem forever at odds, sometimes managing to find common ground when a silly TV show makes them laugh in sync. These aren't moments of grand storytelling, but they're the threads that hold together the Griffin quilt. And then there's the unspoken magic of bedtime in the Griffin home. Not the sitcom gags, not the punchlines, but the small, almost invisible rituals. Lois checking on Stewie even when she knows he's asleep, pulling his blanket a little tighter, unaware that he's plotting world domination in his dreams. Peter wandering in to kiss his children goodnight, sometimes stumbling over his words, sometimes forgetting, sometimes landing a surprisingly heartfelt gesture. Even Meg, often overlooked, has her quiet moments in bed where she stares at the ceiling and reflects on her place in the family. These nighttime rituals are rarely highlighted, but they're the glue of domestic life, the rhythm that ensures the household continues to function despite the chaos of daylight. But what's interesting about the Griffins is that they are constantly redefining what family looks like. Unlike traditional narratives where parents maintain firm control and children fit neatly into roles, here the boundaries are blurred. Sometimes Lois is the stern leader, sometimes Peter fumbles into authority, and sometimes, even more intriguingly, Stewie takes the reins with his sharp wit and cutting intelligence. This constant shifting of power within the household means no single member is ever fixed into a permanent role. That's part of what makes their story endlessly fascinating. Every episode, every arc, every joke has the potential to shuffle the deck all over again. Consider, for instance, the way the Griffins handle conflict. Rarely do they approach it with calm reasoning. More often than not, it begins with Peter making a wild mistake. Whether it's buying something absurd, misinterpreting Lois's advice, or falling for a harebrained scheme. The fallout trickles into the family in uneven ways. Lois is the anchor who tries to steady the ship. Chris becomes the innocent bystander. Meg absorbs the unfair weight of mockery, and Stewie adds his running commentary, sometimes as a detached observer, sometimes as an instigator. But somehow, after the storm, they always find their way back to one another. This cyclical pattern of chaos and resolution is itself a kind of lore. It's not just about Peter or Lois or the kids individually. It's about the invisible contract of family life, where forgiveness flows as naturally as exasperation, where you can scream at each other in one moment, and share a laugh in the next. The Griffins embody this paradox, and it's why, despite their dysfunction, they remain so deeply relatable. And perhaps the most subtle yet powerful aspect of their household is the way time shapes them. Watching the Griffins isn't just about single moments, but about the accumulation of years. Children grow up, parents grow older, and yet the bond remains intact. This continuity, even amid constant change, is what makes their story resonate. It's why their kitchen, their living room, their quirky dynamics still feel alive after decades of storytelling. So when we look back at Peter and Lois choosing, stumbling, or even accidentally falling into parenthood, it's not just the act of bringing children into the world that matters. It's what unfolded afterward. The Griffins are not defined by how they started, but by how they've continued, messily, hilariously, lovingly. Their legacy is written not in perfect parenting, but in the imperfections that somehow make their home whole. And as this exploration deepens, we're left with the sense that what truly makes the Griffins stand out isn't their quirks alone, but their resilience. Through every fight, every joke, every lapse in judgment, they endure. Not because they're flawless, but because they're bound together in a way that's stronger than the chaos they create. There's something inherently fascinating about the way Peter and Lois embody a contradiction. Two people who seem mismatched on the surface, yet whose lives and choices continue to circle back to one another. Lois refined, intelligent, with a voice of reason buried under years of compromise. Peter loud, reckless, and often oblivious. And yet when you look deeper, the truth becomes more complicated. Their bond is not a fluke of circumstance, but a cycle of attraction, friction, and inevitability. Each fight, each mistake, and each reconciliation writes another chapter in a story that seems doomed and yet destined to continue. But beneath this visible chaos lies a more subtle truth. The shadows cast by their marriage on the children who live under that same roof. Meg, Chris, and Stewie are not just passengers in this storm of affection and dysfunction. They are products of it, shaped in ways that echo both Peter's unpredictability and Lois's quiet frustrations. In fact, one could argue that their lives serve as a mirror, reflecting not just who Peter and Lois are as individuals, but what they've built, intentionally or unintentionally, through their choices. Chris, the middle child, often dismissed as clueless or dim, may actually be the clearest reflection of Peter's contradictions. His heart is kind, unassuming, and pure, but his direction in life wavers because the guidance above him is erratic. But Peter, as a father, he grows up in an environment where mistakes are lessons rarely taught, where chaos is the daily rhythm, and where laughter sometimes takes precedence over stability. Lois, for all her attempts to ground him, struggles to undo the natural currents of Peter's influence. It isn't that Chris is lost. Rather, he is searching for an anchor in a household where anchors are few and far between. Then there is Meg, whose story is perhaps the darkest undercurrent of the Griffin household. Neglect, ridicule, and invisibility define much of her existence. And while it's tempting to dismiss this as simple comedic exaggeration, the roots run deeper. Peter's mockery of Meg isn't just played for laughs. It reflects his inability to see beyond his own shortcomings. Lois, too, falls into the pattern, sometimes offering sympathy, but often complicit in the cycle of neglect. What does that do to a child? Meg becomes the embodiment of forgotten love, a misplaced affection, of a daughter who exists not as a priority, but as a footnote in a family too consumed by its own dysfunction. And then, of course, there is Stewie. Unlike his sibling, Stewie is not merely a byproduct of his parents' actions, but a kind of response to them. His intellect, his schemes, his strange mix of violence and longing, they are not random quirks, but the natural outgrowth of a child hyper-aware of the cracks in the family that surrounds him. While Meg buries her pain in quiet resentment, Stewie channels his awareness into control, manipulation, and a desperate attempt to carve a space where he matters. For him, Peter is often an obstacle, and Lois a fixation, both symbols of the home he loves and despises in equal measure. But it is in examining these children one by one that the real truth of Peter and Lois's marriage come to light. A marriage isn't simply two people bound together. It is also the ripple effect of those bonds, the way their love, or lack of it, radiates outward into the lives of those who depend on them. The Griffin children, each in their own way, carry the imprint of that turbulence. And what's more, they each reveal an uncomfortable truth about Peter and Lois themselves. Chris reveals Peter's immaturity, the way he never fully grasped the responsibilities of adulthood, but passed that uncertainty onto his son. Meg reveals Lois's quiet complicity, the way she allowed herself to be swept into patterns of cruelty and apathy instead of breaking them. And Stewie reveals the cracks in the foundation itself, the way dysfunction breeds not just chaos, but ingenuity, not just destruction, but strange, twisted forms of resilience. This ripple effect of family dynamics is part of what makes the Griffins so compelling. It forces us to ask, how much of who we are is shaped by the homes we come from? How much is destiny and how much is choice? When Peter cracks a joke at Meg's expense, it isn't just comedy, it's the lived experience of a child internalizing her worth. When Lois yells at Peter for his latest blunder, it isn't just nagging, it's the frustration of a woman trying to hold together a household whose walls are always cracking. When Stewie plots to destroy, it isn't just parody, it's the exaggerated voice of a child trying desperately to matter in a world that doesn't quite listen. And yet, amid all this dysfunction, there is still something oddly tender about the Griffin family. For all the insults, for all the neglect, for all the screaming matches and absurd misadventures, they still circle back to each other. They still sit at the same dinner table, share the same roof, and face the world together. The cycle is messy, sometimes cruel, but undeniably unbroken. It's as though the Griffins exist in a paradox. They are both broken and whole, both fractured and united. And perhaps that is what keeps audiences returning. We don't just see comedy in their failures, we see reflections of our own. Families everywhere, in some way, are stitched together with contradictions, with dysfunctions, with secrets and reconciliations. The Griffins are simply a louder, funnier, more exaggerated version of a truth that quietly resides in many homes. That love and chaos are often inseparable. But what if we step back and look beyond the immediate family? What if we examine the ways Peter and Lois's marriage, and by extension, their children, ripple out into Quahog itself? The Griffins don't just exist in isolation. They are woven into a community that both shapes them and responds to their dysfunction. Friends like Quagmire, Cleveland, and Joe are not just side characters. They are witnesses to the family's chaos, sometimes enabling it, sometimes condemning it, and sometimes reflecting their own struggles through it. Quahog is, in many ways, an extension of the Griffin household, a mirror that magnifies both the humor and the heartbreak. This leads us to a deeper question. Do Peter and Lois stay together out of love, habit, or necessity? And what does that mean for the people around them, their children, their friends, and even us as viewers? It's a puzzle that invites us to look beyond the punchlines into the uncomfortable, messy, and strangely familiar reality of love in all its imperfect forms. And so, as we peel back another layer, we find ourselves standing at a crossroads. On one side is the story of Peter and Lois, their fiery passion, their contradictions, their endless cycle of chaos and reconciliation. On the other side is the shadow they cast on their children, on their friends, and even on the town of Quahog itself. To understand the Griffins fully, we cannot separate the two. Their marriage is not just theirs, it belongs to everyone it touches. And so, as Peter's playful irresponsibility and Lois's grounded patience wove their peculiar tapestry through the household, the children grew, each carrying fragments of their parents' quirks, strengths, and contradictions. But what's perhaps most fascinating in the ongoing saga of the Griffin family is not simply how they raised their children, but how their children, in turn, revealed truths about Peter and Lois themselves. Parenting was never a perfect science for them. It was trial and error, love mixed with frustration, guidance tangled with the contradictions. Yet through the missteps and recoveries, the Griffins became more than just a satirical cartoon family. They became a mirror for the chaos, joy, and complexity of real family life. Stewie, the genius baby, was a reflection of Lois's sharp wit and unspoken desires, channeled through his dramatic flair for conquest and domination. He spoke in ways that made him seem worlds apart from other infants, but under his plotting exterior, there was a raw vulnerability. That vulnerability often pointed back to Lois, his mother, whose constant strength and occasional sternness made her both the target of his frustrations and the anchor he could not live without. Peter, for his part, gave Stewie chaos. That unpredictability of Peter's nature fueled Stewie's relentless need for order, control, and authority, a subconscious rebellion against the man who, intentionally or not, often destabilized the family structure. Then came Meg, the overlooked child, bearing the brunt of Peter's mockery and Lois's occasional indifference. Yet Meg represented something crucial, the forgotten middle ground of family life. She was the embodiment of those moments when parents, consumed by chaos or favoritism, lose sight of one child's quiet struggles. Lois's guilt sometimes flickered through in her softer moments with Meg, and Peter's bullying, though exaggerated for comedic effect, reflected the darker tendencies of parents who unintentionally push a child to the margins. Through Meg, the show whispered a truth about family dynamics. Love is not always evenly distributed, and the scars of that imbalance can shape a child forever. Chris, meanwhile, became a strange amalgamation of Peter's laziness and innocence, with Lois's undercurrent of decency buried within him. Chris was awkward, often lost in his own world, but he carried within him a gentleness that Peter often lacked, and a willingness to connect that Lois struggled to balance with discipline. If Meg was the ignored one, Chris was the tolerated one, a child who didn't demand too much, but never quite shined either. Yet in Chris's simplicity, there was a reminder of the quiet children in every family, the ones who aren't loud enough to command attention, but whose presence is still essential to the household rhythm. Through these children, the Griffin family wasn't just a collection of exaggerated archetypes. They became a study in how parental flaws ripple outward, shaping children in ways both obvious and subtle. Peter's recklessness made his children either rebel against chaos or sink into it. Lois's discipline created structure, but also resentment and pressure. Together they formed a parenting style that was messy, inconsistent, but deeply human. As the seasons unfolded, the idea of whether Peter and Lois ever truly planned their children became more blurred. Were these kids deliberate, the product of love and shared decisions? Or were they happy accidents born from passion, impulsivity, and the unpredictability of life? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. The show has hinted at both scenarios, moments where Peter and Lois appeared to consciously step into parenthood, and others where the chaos of their love life made the idea of planning seem laughable. What remained consistent, however, was that once the children existed, Peter and Lois had to face the realities of raising them. Planned or not, intentional or accidental, the Griffins became a family because they chose, again and again, to keep moving forward together. There's a strange beauty in that idea. Families are rarely neat, and the Griffins embody that truth better than most. Accidents happen, plans fall apart, mistakes linger. But through all of it, bonds form, evolve, and redefine themselves. The Griffins, chaotic as they are, reflect this reality. That family isn't just about perfect choices or flawless planning. It's about resilience, forgiveness, and the willingness to endure. The Griffin household is not without its darker shades. Stewie's animosity toward Lois, for example, goes beyond the surface-level humor of a baby plotting matricide. It reveals the undercurrents of resentment that can form when children feel overshadowed or suffocated by their parents. His violence, absurd as it is, symbolizes the primal rebellion children often harbor when they perceive imbalance in their parental relationships. Meg's mistreatment, too, forces the audience to confront the uncomfortable truth of neglect and ridicule in families, a truth softened only by the cartoon setting, but recognizable nonetheless. Even Chris's awkwardness and Peter's obliviousness highlight how parents can miss the quiet needs of their children, failing to nurture potential that might otherwise thrive. Yet the show balances these darker elements with humor, laughter, and absurdity, reminding us that while families can hurt, they can also heal. Stewie's vendetta against Lois is always tempered by moments where his love for her slips through an embrace, a compliment, a slip of vulnerability. Meg, despite her suffering, still seeks love from her parents, showing the enduring hope that most children hold even when mistreated. And Chris, though often confused or ignored, radiates a certain loyalty to his family, proving that even imperfect bonds can create a foundation of belonging. In all of this, Peter and Lois's relationship remains the anchor. No matter how chaotic the children become, no matter how dysfunctional the family dynamic appears, Peter and Lois repeatedly return to one another. Their marriage is messy, inconsistent, and full of challenges, but it survives because of the strange alchemy between them. His recklessness balanced by her resilience, his childishness tempered by her maturity, and her occasional flaws softened by his unwavering, if sometimes misguided love. The Griffins' story is less about perfection and more about persistence. They remind us that families aren't defined by flawless execution, but by the willingness to continue showing up, even when things fall apart. Whether their children were planned or accidents, whether they succeeded or failed as parents, Peter and Lois embody the universal truth that raising a family is an ongoing experiment. Mistakes happen, regrets linger, but love, strange, messy, imperfect love, remains the glue that binds it all together. So as we look at the Griffin household, with its loud arguments, its absurd adventures, its satirical extremes, and its rare but heartfelt moments of tenderness, we see not just a cartoon family, but a reflection of ourselves. The laughter is exaggerated, the mistakes blown out of proportion. But beneath it all lies something familiar, the struggle to balance chaos with care, discipline with freedom, love with frustration. Perhaps that's why Family Guy continues to resonate even after decades. Beneath the satire and absurdity, it captures the contradictions of real family life, where children can be both blessings and burdens, where parents can fail and still be loved, where planning matters less than persistence, and where, despite everything, the bond of family endures. And as the Griffin story continues, one thing remains clear. Whether by accident or design, by choice or by chance, their family exists because, in the end, Peter and Lois keep choosing each other. And through that choice, their children, flawed and overlooked as they may be, inherit something far more important than perfection. They inherit resilience, the quiet strength of survival, and the strange, enduring power of love. And so, with the weight of Peter and Lois's past choices, their decisions, and the complex intertwining of passion, accidents, and unspoken intentions behind the Griffin family's very existence, we find ourselves arriving at a new point of reflection. What does it mean to live within a family whose foundations are built not on perfect planning, not on pristine ideals, but on a mess of desire, circumstance, and flawed humanity? To answer this, we need to shift our lens, not just at the past that gave birth to Meg, Chris, and Stewie, but at the forces within the family that shape their continuing lives day after day. For even as the question of origin lingers, what matters just as much, if not more, is the strange, enduring fabric of family life inside the Griffin household. At its surface, the Griffin home in Quahog may look like any other. The little white house with green shutters neatly situated on Spooner Street almost blends into the background of suburban America. It is, at first glance, the kind of house that hides secrets rather than announces them. To an outsider, it may even seem ordinary, a family of 5, a talking dog, the occasional neighbor dropping by. But step inside, and that ordinary facade peels away to reveal a tapestry of chaos, absurdity, dysfunction, and yes, love, though often buried beneath layers of comedy and conflict. This new stage in our story takes us deeper into that house, not merely as a backdrop, but as a living stage where the Griffin family play out their tangled relationships. Because within those walls, the past decisions of Peter and Lois do not fade into history. They echo constantly, shaping the daily rhythm of their children's lives and the constant dance of dysfunction that defines their existence. To see how the Griffins truly operate, one must walk through their door, sit in their living room, and watch how each character's quirks and flaws collide with one another. And when we begin with Peter, it's impossible to overlook the way his sheer presence dictates the tone of the household. Peter is the gravitational force, chaotic and unpredictable, who sets events into motion, often without realizing the consequences. His humor, his recklessness, and his inability to filter his impulses create the constant storms around which Lois and the children must either bend or break. Yet within his foolishness there are occasional, fleeting glimpses of sincerity, moments where love bubbles through his rough edges, reminding us why Lois stays, why the children endure, and why the family, despite everything, remains intact. Lois, of course, is the anchor. She is not perfect. Her flaws and dark impulses have shown themselves plenty, but compared to Peter's erratic energy, she represents stability. Or perhaps it's better to say she tries to represent stability. Lois holds the family together through sheer will, balancing her roles as mother, wife, and sometimes reluctant voice of reason. But beneath her efforts to appear composed, there's exhaustion, a quiet recognition that she too has made compromises, that the life she leads is not the one she once imagined. It is here in the kitchen, conversations, and the late-night sighs when the kids are asleep, that Lois's complexity emerges, not just as a caretaker, but as a woman still wrestling with the choices she made years ago. The children, of course, carry the brunt of these dynamics in ways both seen and unseen. Meg, ever the overlooked one, absorbs the neglect and ridicule like a sponge, her existence defined less by her own desires and more by the lack of recognition she receives. Her attempts to assert herself often fall flat, swallowed by the indifference of her parents and the cruelty of her peers. And yet, in the stillness of her bedroom, Meg's resilience whispers through. It is in her continued striving, despite rejection, that we glimpse her unacknowledged strength. Chris, on the other hand, embodies innocence teetering on the edge of corruption. His childlike worldview is constantly at risk of being warped by Peter's influence, whether through misguided life lessons, reckless encouragement, or outright neglect. And yet, Chris clings to his imagination, his art, and his somewhat oblivious kindness. In him lies both the Griffin family's vulnerability and its hope, proof that even in a household defined by chaos, innocence can survive, if only barely. Then there is Stewie, the wild card, the paradox. Born of an accident or perhaps strange, unplanned passion, Stewie is at once the most detached from the family unit and the most entangled in its dysfunction. His brilliance, his schemes, his biting wit, all of these stand in stark contrast to the bumbling simplicity of the household around him. Yet for all his ambitions of world domination and destruction, Stewie cannot fully sever his ties to his family. His grudging reliance on Brian, his occasional flashes of vulnerability with Lois, and even his strange, twisted rivalries with his siblings reveal that, underneath his sharp edges, he too is shaped and bound by the Griffin dynamic. And then, of course, there is Brian, the talking dog, the intellectual companion, the constant observer who exists somewhere between family member and outsider. Brian is the voice of reason, the critic of Peter's follies, the one who sees the dysfunction most clearly. And yet, he is also deeply flawed, often hypocritical, and struggling with his own identity. His presence in the house is not merely that of a pet. It is that of a mirror, reflecting both the absurdity and the humanity of the Griffins back to themselves. Together, these figures weave the daily life of the Griffins, a life that is simultaneously ridiculous and oddly familiar. Their home may be filled with outrageous antics, surreal cutaway gags, and constant clashes, but at its heart, it is a family like many others, flawed, fractured, stumbling forward in the only way they know how. The beauty of their story lies not in perfection, but in persistence, the ability to keep living, keep fighting, and keep loving, even when that love is messy and hidden beneath layers of dysfunction. And so, as we peer deeper into this stage of the Griffin household, the question becomes not only how they came to be, but how they continue to be. What keeps them together despite the chaos? What hidden threads of loyalty, dependence, or even unspoken affection bind them? To understand this, we must look not just at the dramatic events of their lives, but at the small, quiet moments. The overlooked gestures, the fleeting glances, the humor that arises even in hardship. Because within those details lies the true essence of the Griffins. Not perfect love, but enduring connection. It is here, in this delicate exploration, that the next part of our story unfolds. A journey not just through the household's dysfunction, but through the strange beauty of its survival. The rhythm of Peter's and Lois's relationship carried on through the years in patterns that were both familiar and unpredictable, as though the family dynamic itself was a living organism, shifting, bending, and reshaping itself with time. After all the chaos of their younger years, after the challenges of becoming parents and growing into adulthood together, there was always this curious balancing act between routine and surprise. Every family has its rituals, quiet dinners, television habits, or the subtle ways people show care without even realizing it. For the Griffins, those rituals took stranger, louder, and sometimes more absurd forms. Yet at the heart of it, they reflected something deeply human. The way love weaves itself into the background of daily life until it becomes a rhythm you almost don't notice, but would feel utterly lost without. In their home, bedtime routines could be chaotic. Stewie plotting something diabolical, Chris lost in his own imagination, Meg retreating into her own world, and Brian casually offering witty commentary while nursing a martini. And yet, amid this madness, Peter and Lois would always find a pocket of time, however brief, to acknowledge each other. Maybe it was a tired glance after everyone finally went to bed. Maybe it was Lois smoothing down Peter's shirt before he left for work, or Peter jokingly trying to get her to laugh when she looked stressed. These weren't grand gestures of romance. They were the tiny anchors of their marriage, invisible stitches that kept them bound together when everything else threatened to come apart. But what really made their bond interesting wasn't just the ordinary, it was how the extraordinary would constantly intrude into their lives. Think of all the times Peter dragged the family into the bizarre. Time travel, adventures across alternate universes, epic battles with chickens, brushes with fame, and even encounters with death itself. These were experiences no ordinary marriage manual could prepare anyone for. Lois, for all her frustrations, had adapted in a way that only she could. She could scold Peter in one breath, and then stand shoulder to shoulder with him in a fight against some ludicrous cosmic danger in the next. Her loyalty wasn't blind, but it was resilient. She saw him for who he was, flaws and all, and chose to stand by him anyway. This resilience was mirrored in Peter in his own strange way. He didn't articulate it with tenderness, nor did he always recognize Lois's sacrifices in the moment. But deep down, his love for her was as solid as anything in his world. His wild escapades often put her patience to the test, yet whenever he thought he might lose her, even temporarily, it cut deeper than he ever expected. There were moments in the series where this shone through, when his goofy facade cracked just enough to reveal sincerity. Those moments, rare as they might be, spoke volumes about how much she truly meant to him. When we think about marriage in Family Guy's world, it becomes clear that Peter and Lois are not a picture of perfection. They are far from the idealized sitcom couple. But that's what makes them so fascinating. They are messy, complicated, and often ridiculous, and yet they stay together. In many ways, that imperfect persistence is more real than any polished version of love could ever be. Their story isn't one of flawless harmony, but of weathering storms, laughing through absurdity, and finding connection even in the strangest corners of life. As their children grew into their own chaotic selves, Peter and Lois's bond often shifted under the weight of parenting. Raising Stewie with his intellect and dangerous ambitions meant constantly navigating challenges that no ordinary couple could relate to. Chris's innocence and social awkwardness pulled them in another direction, requiring patience and guidance. Meg, too often neglected, carried her own quiet story of longing for attention and belonging. And through all of this, Peter and Lois were more than just individuals. They were the center of the household, the gravitational force that kept the family from completely spinning out into space. This role wasn't easy. Lois sometimes bore the heavier burden of responsibility, the one who picked up the slack when Peter's antics spiraled out of control. But she wasn't without her flaws either. Her temper, her sharp tongue, and her own complicated desires would sometimes cause rifts, and yet they always circled back to each other because the truth was that no one else could quite understand the strange orbit of their lives like they did. The quirks of their marriage also highlight a theme that runs deep through Family Guy itself, the tension between normalcy and absurdity. On the surface, they are a middle-class couple raising kids in a suburban town. Scratch the surface, and you find interdimensional travel, bizarre friendships, and surreal adventures. Their marriage is stretched across these two extremes, always balancing the mundane with the extraordinary. In this way, their relationship becomes more than just a sitcom marriage. It becomes a commentary on how love adapts, survives, and even thrives in chaos. There's also something quietly poetic in the way Peter and Lois's love story plays out against the backdrop of Quahog. Quahog itself is absurd, filled with eccentric neighbors, oddball scenarios, and a constant stream of unpredictability. And yet, amid all of this, the Griffins' home stands as both a stage and a shelter. Within those walls, Lois and Peter create a shared space where they can argue, laugh, fall apart, and come back together again. Their home isn't perfect, often messy, noisy, and unpredictable, but it is the place where their love continues to grow in spite of everything. This is where the emotional undercurrent of their relationship really reveals itself. Beneath the gags, beneath the punchlines and surreal scenarios lies a simple but powerful truth. Love, in its most enduring form, isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. It's about returning, time and again, to the person who knows your flaws and still chooses to stay. For Peter and Lois, that presence is what sustains them. Whether they're dealing with family drama, Peter's next outrageous idea, or Stewie's schemes, they return to each other like clockwork. It's not always graceful, but it's always there. If we look closely, their story becomes almost archetypal. The fool and the caretaker, the dreamer and the realist, the chaos and the anchor. Every relationship, in some way, dances along this balance of opposites. But with Peter and Lois, the dance is exaggerated, stretched into absurd proportions, and laid bare for audiences to laugh at. And yet, within that exaggeration, there's something recognizable. Who hasn't felt the frustration of dealing with a partner's flaws? Who hasn't laughed at the quirks that make someone both lovable and maddening? Who hasn't leaned on a loved one in the middle of life's unpredictability? And so, as we sit with their story, the laughter slowly gives way to recognition. It's not just about two cartoon characters in a dysfunctional sitcom. It's about the way love actually works. Messy, chaotic, resilient, sometimes hilarious, sometimes painful, but always worth holding on to. The more their journey is explored, the more it becomes clear that Peter and Lois embody something universal about relationships. They remind us that love doesn't exist in a vacuum. It lives in the middle of arguments, inside laughter, and even in the silence after a long day. Their story is one of persistence, of choosing each other again and again, even when life, or Peter's latest antics, make it difficult. And that, perhaps, is the truest kind of love there is. And so Peter Griffin, the loud, unpredictable force at the center of the Griffin household, stumbled into his role as husband and father, not through careful planning or wisdom, but through sheer audacity and accident. But as we peel back the layers of this strange man, we find that Peter's story is not simply about himself. It is also about the ways he has shaped those closest to him. especially as children. Because behind every ridiculous antic, every reckless decision, and every moment of bizarre triumph, there is always the lingering question. What did his children inherit from him? What part of his chaos became their chaos? What pieces of Peter echo through Stewie, Meg, and Chris? To understand this, we need to look at the children not as isolated characters, but as extensions of Peter's bizarre legacy. Each of them carries something from him, sometimes obvious, sometimes hidden, sometimes twisted in ways that are only recognizable if you step back and see the family as a whole. And in this light, Peter Griffin becomes more than just the bumbling patriarch. He becomes the accidental architect of three very different, yet equally strange lives. Let's start with Meg, the most overlooked and dismissed member of the Griffin family. On the surface, it seems like Meg inherited nothing from Peter. She's not wild, she's not reckless, and she's certainly not adored. Instead, she often bears the brunt of Peter's ridicule, treated as less than her siblings, mocked openly in ways that cross from humor into cruelty. But in reality, Meg's endurance, her ability to withstand relentless humiliation and still continue on, is a distorted reflection of Peter's own resilience. Peter is constantly battered by life, losing jobs, getting into fights, suffering physical harm, and yet, like Meg, he always bounces back. Meg's survival in a household that often erases her is Peter's survival instinct, passed down in a subtler, more tragic form. Meg's connection to Peter also lies in her desperate need for validation. Peter may be loud and arrogant, but deep down he craves approval, whether it's from his boss, his friends, or even the celebrities he idolizes. The same hunger runs through Meg, but instead of seeking laughter or admiration, she simply wants acknowledgement, to be seen as worthy. Peter's need for recognition became a twisted inheritance, manifesting in Meg as a constant struggle for acceptance. Her pain is rooted in Peter's own flaws, which have trickled down in ways he doesn't even realize. Then there's Chris, Peter's only son, and perhaps the clearest mirror of his father. Chris embodies Peter's simplicity, his naivety, and his awkward lack of awareness. But where Peter transforms those qualities into absurd comedy, Chris often becomes the silent victim of them. Still, there's a purity to Chris that mirrors Peter's own childlike innocence. Neither of them is driven by malice. Their mistakes come from ignorance or misplaced enthusiasm rather than cruelty. In this way, Chris is both Peter's shadow and his legacy. What's fascinating is how Chris has inherited Peter's physicality, too. The Griffin men are built in a way that seems larger than life, their bodies used as tools for both comedy and vulnerability. Chris, like Peter, is defined by his size, his awkwardness, and the way he carries himself in a world that doesn't quite know what to do with him. He is Peter, but younger, more malleable, and perhaps more capable of escaping the pitfalls his father stumbled into, if only he could find his way. And then, of course, there's Stewie. At first glance, Stewie seems like the complete opposite of Peter. Calculating, intellectual, articulate, with dreams of domination that stretch far beyond the limitations of his household. But scratch beneath the surface and you'll see that Stewie too carries Peter's chaos, just in a different form. Peter is reckless, while Stewie is meticulous. Peter is loud, while Stewie is precise. But both are driven by an insatiable desire to impose themselves on the world, to leave a mark so big it can't be ignored. Stewie's schemes may be grandiose, his inventions otherworldly, but the spirit behind them is the same wild impulse that drives Peter to charge headfirst into outlandish situations. Both father and son live as though the rules don't apply to them, as though reality is something they can bend or break at will. Stewie may sharpen this into intellect, while Peter dulls it into slapstick. But the root is the same. It's chaos made flesh, passed from father to son, in a form that neither fully understands. But perhaps the strangest connection between Peter and his children is that they all exist as extensions of his flaws. Meg inherits his insecurity, Chris inherits his simplicity, Stewie inherits his chaos. In each child we see fragments of Peter, refracted into different shapes and colored by their own struggles. And the more you see it this way, the clearer it becomes that Peter Griffin's greatest legacy isn't his wild antics or bizarre adventures. It's the way his essence lives on in his children, shaping them into reflections of himself, whether they like it or not. Yet this inheritance isn't just a one-way street. The children, in their own ways, reshape Peter too. Meg's endurance forces him, however faintly, to acknowledge the consequences of his cruelty. Chris's innocence reflects back at him, showing a softer side that sometimes peeks through his bravado. And Stewie, in his brilliance, reminds Peter of something he doesn't often realize, that within his chaotic life, there can be strange forms of genius, even if he doesn't possess it himself. This is the tangled web of the Griffin family. A father who gives chaos without meaning to, and children who absorb it in ways that twist their own lives. It's not a happy inheritance, but it's one that binds them all together in strange, undeniable ways. And in this binding lies the truth of Family Guy's lore. The family is not just a collection of odd individuals, but a strange echo chamber where flaws reverberate, repeat, and transform across generations. Peter, Lois, Meg, Chris, and Stewie aren't just living together, they're entangled, each carrying a part of the other in ways that are both comic and tragic. As we linger here, in this reflection of Peter's legacy upon his children, we begin to see how the Griffin household functions less as a traditional family and more as a bizarre laboratory. Each child becomes an experiment born from Peter's influence, each result more unpredictable than the last. And while the outside world may laugh at their antics, within the walls of their home, the truth is much darker, much stranger. They are all echoes of a man who never knew how to be a father and yet became one anyway. And in these tensions, the story of Peter and Lois kept returning to the same truth. Love is never perfect, never without its cracks and blemishes, but somehow, through humor, resilience, and a stubborn refusal to quit on one another, they always managed to find a way back. Even when Peter's mistakes carved deep scars, even when Lois's disillusionment cut through the air of their household, there was always an undercurrent that suggested, almost demanded, that their story wasn't one of simple endings, but of messy, complicated continuations. It was here that Quahog itself became more than just a backdrop. The town wasn't merely the setting of their adventures. It was the environment that both nurtured and tested them. Every familiar face, Cleveland, Joe Quagmire, was a reminder that relationships, for better or worse, didn't exist in isolation. Peter and Lois's marriage was tangled up with the friendships, scandals, and gossip that echoed across Spooner Street. It was impossible to separate the life of their family from the environment around them, and in that sense, the world often held up a mirror to their marriage. Sometimes this mirror reflected the sheer absurdity of their bond. How many times had Peter concocted schemes that risked not only his own reputation, but the very stability of their household? From buying dangerous pets to diving into reckless business ventures, He had a knack for dragging the Griffin family into chaos. And yet, Lois, more often than not, found herself cleaning up after him. Not simply because she had to, but because, in some strange way, she chose to. She saw in Peter not just the man who stumbled into disaster, but the man who, deep down, carried the kind of heart she had fallen for. At times, though, that mirror reflected something darker. Peter's negligence often bordered on self-destruction, and Lois's ability to forgive sometimes looked less like strength and more like weariness. There were moments, fleeting perhaps, but noticeable, where Lois's eyes seemed to search for something beyond her husband, a yearning, not necessarily for another man, but for the possibility of a life less exhausting, a life where she wasn't constantly holding everything together. Those moments were rare, but when they surfaced, they carried the weight of truth. And yet what made their marriage enduring wasn't denial of these fractures, but the ability to survive them. In fact, it was often in the quiet aftermath of arguments where the true shape of their bond emerged. A small touch on the arm, a shared laugh in bed, or a whispered, "I'm sorry," when no one else was listening. These were the glue that kept the cracks from widening into irreparable breaks. Their marriage was, in its way, a story of resilience written in moments too small for grand gestures, but essential all the same. This resilience also radiated into the children they raised. Stewie, with his elaborate intelligence and twisted ambitions, was in many ways the product of both Peter's chaos and Lois's control. Meg's endless struggle for validation mirrored the overlooked cracks in their marriage, while Chris's simplicity and naivety captured the innocence that Peter himself sometimes embodied. The Griffin children were not accidents of circumstance, but reflections, distorted, magnified, of their parents' dynamic. In watching them grow, you could trace the unspoken battles between Peter and Lois, the silent compromises that shaped the household. But resilience came at a cost, and it was not without its ironies. For every night Lois lay awake worrying about bills or Peter's latest disaster, there was a part of her that understood the irony of her own choices. She had married a man whose flaws were as obvious as his laughter, whose unpredictability could never be tamed. And Peter, in his own way, often seemed to marvel at the fact that Lois stayed by his side. He may not have always articulated it, but the gratitude lingered beneath his clumsy apologies and his exaggerated bravado. The strange beauty of their relationship was how these contradictions existed side by side without canceling each other out. Love and frustration, intimacy and resentment, loyalty and discontent. All of it lived within the same household. And perhaps that was what gave the Griffins their odd sense of authenticity. Beneath the cartoonish exaggerations and outrageous storylines, there was something startlingly real about a marriage that wavered but never fell. And through this, Peter and Lois were never alone in their struggles. Quagmire's sleazy encouragements, Joe's reminders of responsibility, Cleveland's laid-back advice, all of these friendships wove themselves into the texture of their marriage. Sometimes these influences made things worse, as when Quagmire's attraction to Lois simmered just below the surface, threatening the delicate balance of trust. Other times they served as lifelines, pulling Peter and Lois back into the rhythm of everyday family life. It was in this tension, between the absurd and the intimate, that their relationship thrived. For every moment of neglect, there was another of surprising tenderness. For every disaster Peter brought home, there was a moment when Lois's laughter broke through, reminding them both why they were still together after all this time. And for every temptation to imagine a life apart, there was the undeniable pull of the bond they had built, flawed though it might be. This is where their story stands out. Not in the grand moments, but in the small, almost invisible acts of staying. Staying when it would have been easier to leave. Staying even when the world or their own instincts suggested otherwise. And perhaps that was the true measure of Peter and Lois. Not perfection, not even happiness in its purest form, but persistence. A refusal to give up on something messy, complicated, and profoundly human. As the nights rolled on in Quahog, with the TV flickering in the background and the sound of Stewie plodding from his crib, Peter and Lois remained what they had always been. Two people bound by a love that wasn't always easy, but was always real. They were far from the perfect couple, but in their imperfections lay the story of a marriage that had weathered more storms than most. And as the years unfolded, one truth became clearer with each passing season. Peter and Lois might fight, falter, and even fall apart for a time. But somehow, inevitably, they would find their way back to each other again. And perhaps that is the essence of the Griffin household. Not stability, not certainty, but the enduring truth that love, messy, chaotic, frustrating love, has a way of holding everything together, even when it shouldn't. It was in these quiet, in-between moments that the Griffin family truly revealed themselves. Not in the wild antics that made the neighbors whisper, not in the absurd adventures that stretched belief, but in those hushed pauses where they were simply together. For every fight and frustration, every broken dish or broken rule, there was this undertone of shared life, a rhythm that bound them despite themselves. And in a way, that rhythm was more powerful than any grand gesture of love or loyalty. It was just the steady beat of their existence, always carrying them forward. And yet what makes their story more fascinating is not only the rhythm of ordinary family life, but how those moments sit alongside the extraordinary. Because the Griffins were never just another suburban family, not when their nights could be filled with time-traveling escapades, unexpected philosophical debates, or surreal chaos that bent the fabric of their world. And still, after the madness had passed, there was always breakfast in the morning and the hum of conversation around the kitchen table. Peter might be loud and clumsy, but when he sits down with Lois over a late-night snack, he softens in ways he doesn't even notice. Lois may scold her children and sometimes feel weighed down by responsibility, but her laugh, warm and sharp at the same time, pulls everyone back into orbit. Chris, in his awkwardness, brings a strange honesty that strips away the pretenses others cling to. Meg, so often overlooked, is still there, holding her place, her quiet persistence echoing louder than anyone admits. And Stewie, for all his schemes and ambitions, for all the brilliance and menace that define him, still wants to be heard, still wants to belong. Even Brian, with his wit and flaws, drifts back into the fold, because no matter how far he wanders, he's part of this household tapestry. It's this push and pull, between chaos and calm, distance and intimacy, that makes their family so strangely magnetic. They are dysfunctional by any measure, and yet beneath the cracks, something enduring persists. It isn't always tender, and it isn't always kind, but it's unbreakable in its own crooked way. And if you look closer, you notice how often these connections emerge in the smallest gestures. Peter putting an arm around Lois almost absent-mindedly after a long day. Lois humming to herself while washing dishes, a tune that somehow soothes the atmosphere even if no one's paying attention. Stewie watching them all, feigning indifference, but caught in the quiet pull of belonging. Brian sighing dramatically as he pretends he's above it all, but smiling at the sight nonetheless. These small things weave the invisible thread that holds them together. Family for the Griffins is not about being perfect or even about being consistent. It's about being there when the noise fades, when the lights dim, when the distractions settle. It's about surviving the storms together and still finding themselves again and again around the same table. Their story is not about teaching lessons or living up to ideals. It's about stumbling, laughing, yelling, forgiving, and carrying on. But here's the hidden truth that makes their lore so rich. For all the absurdity and dysfunction, there's a strange beauty in their survival. No matter how many times the world outside shifts, or how many times they themselves spin out of control, the Griffins always circle back to each other. Sometimes in anger, sometimes in resignation, and sometimes in love. But always they return. And isn't that, in the end, the essence of family? Not the flawless picture of harmony, but the messy reality of coming back again and again, even when it isn't easy. For Peter and Lois, for their children, for Brian, it has never been about perfection. It has always been about persistence. That quiet decision, unspoken but deeply felt, that they are bound together no matter what. Perhaps that's why their story feels timeless, even when draped in pop culture references and outrageous adventures. Beneath the layers of comedy and chaos lies something every listener recognizes, that strange mixture of frustration and devotion, of wishing for peace, but knowing you wouldn't trade the chaos for anything else. Because the chaos, in some inexplicable way, is home. And so as the night in Quahog drapes itself across Spooner Street once more, the Griffins return to that imperfect rhythm. Peter might still make another questionable decision tomorrow. Lois may raise her voice and then sigh in exasperation. Chris may dream strange dreams. Meg may nurse quiet hopes. Stewie may scheme, and Brian may pontificate. But when morning comes, the family will gather again. Bowls of cereal on the table, voices overlapping, the television humming in the background, and the rhythm will pick up once more. This is the strange, enduring magic of the Griffin family. A home where absurdity meets tenderness, where dysfunction meets persistence, where chaos meets love. It is not always visible, and it is rarely neat, but it is always there. And as we drift with them through their lore, through the moments that make them laugh, fight, and endure, we find a reflection of our own imperfections. We see in them the reminder that family is not about avoiding the mess. It is about learning to live within it, and still finding a way back to each other. And so, as one chapter closes, we leave them not with a sense of conclusion, but with the knowledge that their rhythm continues, tomorrow and the day after. And the day after that, through laughter, through frustration, through love. The Griffins will keep going, and in their persistence, they remind us of what it means to hold on, even in the strangest, most chaotic of families. The rhythm continues, steady and imperfect, carrying the Griffin family into yet another day. That is the strange thing about life in Quahog. It never really pauses. The night passes, the sun rises, and what felt like a conclusion is simply another step in an endless cycle. Just as the family drifts through sleep, their world awakens again, unpredictable as always, blending ordinary mornings with extraordinary detours. And so, as Chapter 5 begins, we step back into their lives, not with finality, but with continuity, as if we are merely listening to another verse in a song that never ends. This chapter invites us to lean closer to see not only the rhythm of their household, but the deeper forces that shape it. Because within every Griffin, beneath the laughter and dysfunction, lie hidden currents of longing, fear, and resilience. They are not only a family bound by circumstance, but also individuals carrying their own stories, desires, and contradictions. To watch them together is one thing, but to understand them, you must also see them apart. Take Lois, for instance. In the final hush of night, after the children have fallen asleep and Peter's snores rumble through the bedroom, she sometimes sits in silence. A cup of tea cooling beside her, her gaze unfocused. She allows herself a moment of quiet. For Lois, so often, the backbone of the household, these rare fragments of solitude are reminders that she is more than just a mother or a wife. She is a woman with her own dreams, frustrations, and unspoken regrets. She has learned to play many roles, but beneath them all lies the simple truth that she is still searching for balance, for recognition, for the feeling that she is more than the sum of her responsibilities. And yet, it is this very tension that gives Lois her strength. She shoulders burdens, not because they are easy, but because she cannot imagine letting them fall. She may scold and sigh, but her steady presence anchors the family. Without Lois, the rhythm would falter, unraveling into chaos. In her quiet moments, she might question her place, but when morning comes, she rises again, prepared to hold it all together. Then there is Peter, her eternal counterpart. Where Lois balances duty and quiet strength, Peter embodies impulse and recklessness. He is a man of appetites and impulses, often chasing laughter before reason, stumbling into trouble with the inevitability of gravity itself. Yet for all his flaws, there is a peculiar purity in Peter's chaos. He does not scheme or plot. He simply follows his instincts, whether they lead him into joy or disaster. But Peter, too, has layers hidden beneath the noise. When he laughs, it is genuine. When he loves, it is absolute. His devotion to Lois, however clumsy, is rooted in something real. His loyalty to his family, however poorly expressed, cannot be shaken. And so while he may be the spark that ignites half their problems, he is also the flame that keeps their household alive. Without Peter's reckless energy, the Griffins would lose a strange kind of vitality, the madness that keeps them moving forward. Chris, meanwhile, wanders between childhood and adulthood, often overlooked, often misunderstood. His world is a strange blend of innocence and curiosity, a mixture of dreams and awkwardness. He stumbles through life with the wide-eyed wonder of someone who does not yet understand the rules, but perhaps that is what makes him so quietly profound. Chris may not be brilliant in the way Stewie is, or ambitious in the way Lois is, but he has a softness that cuts through the family's chaos. His laughter is genuine, his heart unguarded, his mistakes honest. In a family full of noise and bravado, Chris brings a rare kind of simplicity, the reminder that not everything needs to be complicated to matter. Meg, on the other hand, embodies resilience. So often dismissed, so often the target of ridicule, she endures with a quiet persistence that speaks louder than words. To be Meg is to live in the shadow of indifference, to struggle for recognition in a household that rarely offers it. And yet, she stays. She shows up at the table. She voices her thoughts. She keeps pushing forward. Meg may feel invisible at times, but her presence, steady and unyielding, holds more weight than the family admits. She is a survivor in a home that does not always see her, and that survival gives her story its quiet power. And then there is Stewie, the child genius, the schemer, the dreamer with a voice far beyond his years. He is, in many ways, the sharpest reflection of the Griffins' contradictions. Brilliant, yet vulnerable, menacing, yet tender, detached, yet desperate for connection. Stewie's ambitions often stretch far beyond the walls of their home. But no matter how grand his plans, he is still pulled back by something he cannot quite name. For all his wit and sharpness, Stewie is still a child, still learning what it means to belong. And though he resists it with every fiber of his dramatic being, he cannot escape the truth that he is part of this family, bound to them by more than circumstance. And Brian, perhaps the strangest of them all. A dog, yes, but one who walks and speaks and drinks and questions. Brian is the philosopher of the household, though often a flawed one. He prides himself on his intellect, but stumbles on his own vices. He yearns for meaning, but often loses himself in distraction. He is both grounded and restless, loyal and wandering. Yet, like the others, Brian always returns. His place in the family may shift, sometimes mentor, sometimes peer, sometimes cynic, but he remains part of the fabric, and in his contradictions, he mirrors the contradictions of them all. This is where Chapter 5 takes its shape, not in the noise of the world outside, but in the hidden lives of each member of the Griffin household. Together, they form a chorus of chaos and comedy, but separately, they are individuals with their own silent stories. To understand their lore is to understand these dualities, the shared rhythm of the family, and the solitary beats of each life within it. And so the day begins again. The sun rises over Spooner Street, spilling light onto the familiar house where the Griffins stir awake. Peter groans, Lois sighs, Chris stumbles out of bed, Meg quietly gathers her things, Stewie stretches in thought, and Brian pads across the floor in search of coffee. Their routine begins once more, shaped by the same rhythm that carried them yesterday. But if you listen closely, you will hear more than routine. You will hear the undercurrents of longing, resilience, and persistence that give their story its heart. Because for all the laughter and chaos, the true lore of the Griffins lies in these quiet truths, that beneath their dysfunction lies devotion, that beneath their chaos lies connection, and that beneath their imperfection lies something strangely enduring. This is not just the story of a family. It is the story of individuals who, despite everything, continue to return to one another. The idea that the Griffin home, despite its constant chaos, could still serve as a container for love is one of the strangest and most fascinating paradoxes in Family Guy. On one hand, it is the setting for some of the most outrageous gags and absurd scenarios, from cutaway jokes to physical comedy. On the other, it is also where Peter and Lois have weathered decades of ups and downs. Their bond has been tested more times than anyone could count, and yet somehow they always circle back to each other. There's a strange reassurance in knowing that even when Peter drives the family into ruin or Lois reaches her breaking point, the cycle always bends back toward reconciliation. It's not about stability exactly, but about endurance, a relationship that somehow endures precisely because it's never expected to make sense. This endurance becomes even more fascinating when one considers how the show frames Peter and Lois's parenting. They are not traditional role models, and yet their dynamic as parents tells a lot about who they are as partners. Peter is the reckless dreamer, often absorbed in his own desires, while Lois tries to play the role of caretaker, though her patience is constantly pushed to the edge. Together, they create a household environment where the children, Meg, Chris, and Stewie, are raised in conditions that would test anyone's resilience. The children themselves are exaggerated reflections of their parents' traits, making the Griffin family feel like a distorted mirror of the American suburban ideal. For instance, Meg's constant suffering is not just about her bad luck. It also represents how Peter and Lois fail, in many ways, to nurture her. Yet at the same time, the fact that she survives all of this neglect, ridicule, and chaos highlights the sheer absurdity of the family unit itself. Lois, despite her sharp tongue and occasional cruelty, often becomes the only one who stands up for Meg, revealing that her maternal instinct still runs deep, even if imperfectly expressed. Peter, in contrast, often contributes to Meg's torment, which complicates his role as a father. And yet, the two of them together remain the architects of this environment, one part comedy, one part tragedy, all stitched together by their enduring partnership. Chris, meanwhile, embodies a different side of the parental equation. His innocence and naivety feel like echoes of Peter's childishness, though without the same destructive energy. Lois sees in him a reflection of the softness Peter often hides behind his wild antics. She tries to guide Chris, even if her efforts sometimes fall flat. Peter, on the other hand, often sees Chris as a buddy rather than a son, treating him more like an equal in his nonsense than someone who needs parental direction. This, in its own way, deepens the strange bond between Peter and Lois because they have to constantly renegotiate their roles as mother and father in response to their children's needs. And then, of course, there is Stewie, the child who never grows up, whose intelligence and ambition dwarf those of his siblings, and whose schemes frequently involve the destruction of his own family, becomes the ultimate reflection of Peter and Lois's relationship. Stewie is both nurtured and stifled by his parents. He is brilliant because he is ignored, ambitious because he is underestimated, and dangerous because of the contradictions in his home. Peter and Lois's parenting doesn't just affect Stewie, it defines him. And the fact that he constantly hovers between love and hatred for Lois, in particular, makes him a fascinating product of their chaotic marriage. In this way, the Griffin children become more than just background characters. They are living proof of what happens when Peter and Lois collide, their flaws, their affection, their battles, and their reconciliations all find their way into the personalities of Meg, Chris, and Stewie. The family may be dysfunctional, but it is dysfunction born of two people who cannot live without each other. And that dysfunction, for better or worse, creates the energy that keeps the household alive. What makes all of this so compelling is that Family Guy never pretends Peter and Lois are perfect parents. They are, in fact, some of the most inconsistent and unpredictable parents on television. But within that inconsistency lies the strange rhythm of their marriage. Lois holds on because she believes she can fix what's broken, and Peter holds on because, deep down, he knows Lois is the only one who truly accepts him, flaws and all. Together they become a paradoxical unit that simultaneously fails and sustains their children. This paradox is where the show often finds its sharpest satire. On the surface, the Griffins are a parody of the American family, constantly skewering suburban life, social norms, and cultural trends. But beneath that parody lies a more intimate story of two people trying, however clumsily, to hold everything together. Peter's recklessness and Lois's resilience clash constantly. Yet it's that clash that creates the fuel for their family's survival. Without Lois, Peter would collapse under the weight of his own antics. Without Peter, Lois would never experience the thrill or frustration that defines her life. Together, they create something that is both absurd and enduring. As viewers, it's easy to laugh at the dysfunction, to point out the flaws and to mock the absurdity of their parenting. But it's also hard to deny the strange comfort that comes from watching them weather every storm. No matter how far things go off the rails, Peter and Lois always find their way back to one another. That sense of inevitability, of a bond that refuses to break no matter how many times it bends, gives Family Guy its strange sense of emotional weight. In this way, the Griffins reflect not just a parody of family life, but a strange, exaggerated version of real human resilience. Families are messy, marriages are flawed, and parenting rarely follows a clear path. Peter and Lois embody all of these truths, magnified through comedy and absurdity, but anchored by something surprisingly real. Their love, however imperfect, sustains not only themselves, but the strange little world around them. And so when one looks at the Griffin household, the laughter, the chaos, the pain, and the survival, it becomes clear that the heart of the show isn't simply in the gags or the satire. It's in the story of two people who, against all odds, continue to choose each other again and again, even when it doesn't make sense. That choice, messy and irrational though it may be, is the foundation upon which everything else is built. And so, as the light of morning finally seemed to wash away the dim glow of night in Quahog, the Griffin family's story came full circle once again. Their laughter, their heartbreak, their endless arguments, and their unshakable togetherness had carried them through more than most families could endure. Yet, what was most striking wasn't the chaos that defined their lives. It was the love that stubbornly lingered beneath it all. The invisible glue that made sure that no matter how far they drifted, they always came back home. This was the unspoken truth of Peter and Lois, a truth reflected in their children. Stewie, the calculating mastermind with dreams larger than life, had never truly left the orbit of his family. His grand schemes, his fleeting desires to escape, all came back to the comfort of that living room couch. Meg, the often ignored middle child, carried within her the resilience that grew from constant rejection. Beneath the hurt, she remained anchored to the family that never really understood her, because somewhere deep down, she understood them. Chris, with his soft heart and awkward charm, symbolized the innocence that Peter himself often lost sight of. And then, of course, there was Brian, the voice of reason, the dog who acted more human than most, the one who often stood on the porch looking in. He had always belonged as much as any of them. Together, they embodied the contradictions of family life, messy, flawed, imperfect, and yet strangely beautiful. For all the dysfunction, the Griffins reflected the universal truth about family, that it's not about perfection, but persistence. It's about waking up every day, knowing that arguments will spark, misunderstandings will grow, laughter will echo, and love will somehow stitch the cracks back together. If you look closer at Peter and Lois, you see this truth in its rawest form. They were never the model couple. Their marriage had weathered infidelities, jealousy, betrayals, and countless poor decisions. And yet, they endured. Peter, in his reckless way, needed Lois's patience to anchor him. Lois, in her fiery resolve, needed Peter's chaos to remind her of the unpredictability of life. Their love wasn't a fairy tale. It was messy, loud, and sometimes painful. But it was real. It was human. And in that humanity lay its power. That power passed down to their children. It didn't always manifest in the ways one might expect. For Stewie, it was the rare moments when he let his guard down and clung to Lois in moments of vulnerability. For Meg, it was the resilience she built, becoming stronger with every slight. For Chris, it was the innocence he somehow preserved, proof that even in a storm one could hold on to gentleness. And for Brian, it was the quiet wisdom he offered when no one else could see the truth. This was the legacy of Peter and Lois. Not wealth, not prestige, not even respect. It was the strength to continue. The strength to get up. To forgive, to laugh, to fight. And to keep moving forward even when the weight of the world tried to push them down. That was their gift to their children, and in turn, to us as the audience. As the camera pans out in imagination, one can almost see the Griffin house from above, bathed in the first golden light of morning. The streets of Spooner Street slowly wake, but inside that two-story home lies the endless cycle of family life. Arguments waiting to spark, laughter waiting to echo, love waiting to heal. It is not perfect, it is not peaceful, but it is alive, and that is what makes it so timeless. Peter and Lois's story is, at its heart, a reflection of what we all know but often forget. That love doesn't always look like a storybook. Sometimes it looks like forgiveness after a fight. Sometimes it looks like holding on when everything seems easier to let go. And sometimes it looks like choosing each other again and again, even when you've seen the worst sides of one another. Family Guy, in its satirical and outrageous way, reminds us of this. Behind the cutaway gags, the absurd adventures, and the boundary-pushing humor lies a story about a family that refuses to quit on each other. A family that teaches us that even in chaos, there can be comfort. Even in dysfunction, there can be love. And so as we close this chapter, the Griffin family remains where they've always been, sitting in their living room, surrounded by laughter and conflict in equal measure, united not by perfection, but by persistence. Their story continues, endlessly unfolding in the heart of Quahog, a reminder that family is never simple, never easy, but always worth it. The last image we're left with is simple. Peter and Lois sitting side by side on the couch, the children scattered around, Brian resting on the rug. They may be shouting, laughing, or simply watching TV together. But whatever they're doing it together. And that, in the end, is the essence of the Griffins. Their love story is not one of fairy tales or flawless moments. It is one of survival, forgiveness, passion, and persistence. It is a story that, for all its absurdity, mirrors the one truth we all know deep down. Love is messy, but it's what holds everything together. And so the tale of Peter and Lois, of the children, and of their legacy finds its pause here. Not an end, for their story is one that lives on each time they walk onto the screen. But a pause, a moment to reflect on the strange, beautiful, dysfunctional masterpiece that is the Griffin family. Because in the end, that's all family ever really is, an unfinished story written every day, full of flaws, but also full of love.